Hello everyone, welcome to Leaning Out of Windows Emergence Translation Hub. My name is Cutler, and this is my esteemed colleague, Ingrid. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which includes the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Important that we are uninvited guests, but that we honor and respect the land that we're on, and that one of the things that's important about the land acknowledgements is not just saying the land acknowledgement, but what it compel us to do. And I think what it does is compel us to be curious about the land that we're on and the questions that we ask, and that we're engaged with the communities that live here. So we want to start with hello? Yes. So this is the Translation Hub, which is in some ways a kind of response to the exhibition that's outside in the concourse, and I'll let Ingrid talk a little bit about the Translation Hub.
Thank you. So the Translation Hub is a term actually coming from our Berlin collaborators, Margit Schiff and Elvira Hofschmidt, who will also be introduced later as moderators. And in this, it's a chance for us all to come together, the artists, the scientists, the scholars, and public, to discuss what is emerging from this work and how do we understand what is going on in this collaboration, and are there certain things that arise. And so in the same sense that this project is a massive collaboration, having the chance within the Translation Hub to collaborate with all of the attendees and to discuss further what is being read, and having the multi-brain kind of components of that is a very rich experience that we will further mine as we understand what's going on.
I think most of you know this, but just to point out, you can hear this? The image up on the screen is a drawing that Ingrid Koenig did of the current the current process design for the exhibition here, and it includes 11 teams. Each team has 1 to 2 physicists, 2 to 3 artists, and a scholar. So we just wanted to share that with you because it sort of guides us, and I think Ingrid's particularly skilled at representing it not just through language, but through images as well. So just to give you a sense of what's happening today, Ingrid and I just do some opening remarks, and then we'll invite up our first panel. And the first panel is called Encountering Emergence Between Art and Physics. So we're very excited about a conversation between Sanem, David, and Kimberly. And then we'll have refreshments from 2 to 2:30, coffee, tea, and cookies. And then Ingrid and I will introduce the second panel, Emergent Metaphors, the visualization process, and our 2 moderators, Elvira and Margaret, and they will then introduce the 3 panelists. And then we hope we have time at the end to include everybody in this conversation, because we know there's some of you that were here from the first phase, Leaning Out of Windows Step 1, focusing on antimatter, so some of you are here, which is wonderful, and then those of you that have been involved in the second phase. So it's kind of this, as Ingrid says, it's this kind of big group of people thinking together in some way.
I should add, the last Translation Hub we had 2 years ago around antimatter, from that emerged the title and the theme for this new round of collaborations. So this was a very important aspect that at that time Jess Brewer proposed, the physicist Jess Brewer proposed the term of emergence. He's not here yet, is he?
Okay. So, oh, there he is. All right, that's a big round of applause. So part of this project is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and part of the original proposal that we did in our application was these research questions and the objectives for the proposed research, so we just wanted to put this up. And some of you, it's a reminder, for some of you it might be new, what it is we're trying to assess, which is transformative methodologies of collaboration, and to engage these diverse languages between artists and physicists. And I should say that we included scholars in the second round, because in the first round we saw some really interesting conversations, but we wanted to see if we can accelerate that a bit. So that's why we added scholars, which wasn't initially in our original description. And what are the possible models for interdisciplinary learning in the studio and the science lab that are creative and effective generators of new knowledge and its visualization? And as you can see, the objectives of the proposed research to explore how artists might work with scientists to develop a shared understanding of how knowledge can be translated across their disciplinary communities, and also to organize and assess a process of interdisciplinary collaboration between art and science that enables hybrid research, which can be shared by artists, scientists, and scholars.
So in this process, we are testing different models of interaction and exchange. And so the first iteration we did of this on antimatter was also a year of production, but a very different process design of how artists and scientists work together. But briefly to say that each artist was assigned a physicist and carried on for different lengths of time process of conversations to understand the premise of antimatter, never with the directive to illustrate or service science, but rather to look at how does the abstract knowledge within physics, how does that move through the poetics of the arts, but not just the poetics, but the politics of art. So one thing that happens within art making is that we pull in an entangled aspect of how the world interacts, and kind of more of a, to quote Donna Haraway, an entangled understanding of interactions between knowledge practices. And we definitely saw that through the process of dealing with antimatter. On the right side, you see the new premise for interactions based on the aspect of emergence, which is not specific like antimatter, which is the physicists all know what that is in a sense, and so there's this kind of almost a hierarchical kind of relationship, whereas with emergence, which goes through philosophy, science, sociology, many areas, so that there's more of a sharing of how one perceives that from these different disciplinary perspectives and knowledge practices.
And we're quite excited too, having worked with research assistants here at Carr. We work with undergraduate and graduate students. So all of our design work is being done by students in the MDiS program, Masters of Design program. So I think it's a really important part of our experience in terms of collaborating, not just with artists and scientists, but also designers in pulling out our vision, but also responding to how they understand these ideas and these concepts. So, just to give you a sense, we have so many images. We didn't want to, we did
Thousands.
But just to give you a sense, so at the beginning of each production phase, we organized with Triumph a seminar. So there was in 2017, a seminar on antimatter, and you can see here the artists and physicists, and they were doing a demonstration with us, demonstrating a kind of a tangible way to understand antimatter. We had to pull underneath our seats a piece of paper, and if it was a red one, we were matter, and if it was a green one, we were antimatter. We had to walk around. If you found someone with the opposite, you would annihilate each other and have to sit down. So it was a way to understand it. And then the seminar on emergence was October 2018, and we also had, I think it was for each one, there's about 5 different physicist presentations trying to come at the topic from different angles. So we just wanted to share that. So we have 3 panelists for today. Sanem Gu, she's out here today. And I'll sort of we'll give you a very, very brief bios. They're all incredibly established, but we shorten their bios just because we want to hear from them. So Sanem is a Vancouver-based scholar, curator, Vancouver-based scholar, currently teaching science studies inspired by social political theory here at Carr University. Working in the intersection of science studies, political theory, and historical sociology, her work is inspired by and a product of social movements of the post-2010 period.
I'm happy to introduce David Morrissey. He's a theoretical physicist at Triumph Canada's Particle Accelerator Centre in Vancouver, and we've worked for many years in different ways through art and science collaborations. But David's research deals with the nature of dark matter and the origin of the matter-antimatter asymmetry. He's particularly interested in finding connections between astrophysical observations of these phenomena and new particles seen in Earth-bound experiments.
And the final panelist is Kimberly Phillips, who is a writer, educator, and curator at the Contemporary Art Gallery here in Vancouver. She holds a PhD in art history, visual art, and theory from the University of British Columbia. Her writings have appeared in Art Forum, Canadian Art, C Magazine, Capilano Review, and Philip. She maintains an active teaching practice in modern contemporary art and curatorial practice here at Emily Park. So, yeah, let us begin.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you Ingrid, thank you Randy. First of all, thank you publicly for the invitation to be part of this project and part of the Translation Hub. It was an amazing experience. David and I were on the same team and we had such good collaboration and amazingly brilliant discussions. And we're probably going to bring some of them in here. What I would like to do today is to address a couple of points. I am going to talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity, about collaboration, about the exhibition, and about the creative processes, and respond to the exhibition towards the end of my talk. These are really notes. I did not prepare a formal presentation, but I did prepare very detailed notes about it. Now, what I would like to start with, and as I was walking around multiple times since the exhibition was up, I would like to start with the first phase of the project and the first exhibition. Because it is interesting that Randy and Ingrid were pointing to one particular point at the opening a couple of days ago, that the first phase of the project, scientists were way too comfortable and they were telling artists what to do, right? And I can see that also with your... No, but your piece, I think it was reflecting that beautifully, right? There's the haziness and everything about it. And the concept, of course, was antimatter, which is like none of us, I can say, when us, I can refer to the lay people here, knew anything about. And in that first phase, what really struck me about the exhibition was that there were lots of graphs, email exchanges, and all those documents about the collaboration process, and they were displayed there. And I think it was fascinating. But compared to this one, because if you walk around this one, you don't see anything about the collaboration process other than the works themselves. We do have like statements over there, but we do not have anything written, any email exchanges or anything that documents the process. And I think that the documentation had to be displayed in the first one, and the collaboration had to be exhibited. And not because the artwork did not reflect the collaboration, but I think it was not yet apparent. And can it be, so this is my question about it, and this is a productive question that I'm trying to work with in relation to this exhibition. Can it be the case that the collaborators were shy to lean out of their windows? And I think in this one, the collaboration is there in the artworks themselves. Nobody is shy. The artworks themselves do reflect something about the concept of emergence. And I'm not going to prolong the suspense. I'm going to say what it is towards the very end, but I want to say it right there, because I'm probably watching too many Hitchcock films these days, and I do not like the whodunits. Okay, so here it is. I think that what these artworks tell about emergence is that we need to start considering emergence as a spatial concept, as a topological concept. Now I know that space and topology are two different concepts, and I will try to use them in their own, in their difference. But I think that what this exhibition tells us, the novelty of this exhibition, which says that this is as an immanent topology, as an assemblage. It is pointing towards this new dimension, which is the dimension of spatiality, which I have not seen in any writings or in any philosophical or social scientific, sociological works, this spatial or topological aspect that we discuss as emergence. Usually when we discuss emergence, we're thinking about the thing that emerges and how we're going to understand that thing. And that thing itself, can we understand it by looking at the parts of the system, or can we understand it by looking at the wholes, and what is the relationship between wholes and part, and what is, like, where does the creativity take place? Does it take place over a long period of time, or over in one of the parts, or in the whole? But I think, so it is most of all related to the object and related to the thing, whereas I think right now, with all the artworks that is around here, that is in the exhibition, I think that we can now think about how to integrate the notion of space and topology into the notion of emergence. Now, one thing that is also, so this is my first point. The other thing that I think that is very interesting about the concept of emergence is that everybody feels comfortable in it. And Ingrid, you and Randy said it as well. It is there in sociology, it is there in philosophy, it is there in physics, it is there, I don't know if it's in mathematics or if it's in any other fields. I only know sociology and philosophy. And I think this is something that we need to be talking about, because how is it that, this is just my curiosity, right? How is it that emergence borders on these very similar questions in very different terrains as physics, sociology, and partially political philosophy? And the answer could not be that physics is the foundational science of all the disciplines, right? Or of all thinking. I don't think we can go there. Maybe it is time to revisit Gaston Bachelard. He is a very interesting philosopher of science and he was writing from 1940s and 50s, who is trying to conceptualize how certain concepts travel between disciplines. Because it is not only within, like in relation to one discipline or the other, that these concepts emerge, but the concepts themselves do have this connection with the cultural field, right? Or what we call or with the everyday conversations, or with the everyday language that we are using. Which is to say that actually the concept of emergence has, in the disciplines, as part of their disciplines, has a relationship with this outside. And it is, I think it's this that is making its movement in all these different terrains very easy, this relationship with their exteriority. That emergence is becoming this pliable, malleable, easy to transport, which means easy to metaphorize and mobilize concept. So this is all to say that, I mean, even before the exhibition, before the collaboration started, what was evident, I think, for all of us is that we all felt that emergence, what emergence is, or we are using it in our daily lives. Where even without trying to define it, it is already part of our vocabulary. So the observation is that for something new to emerge, and this is the thesis that I'm, or the proposal that I'm going with, that this exhibition shows that there is something new in interdisciplinary and in this collaboration. I think we needed something familiar. And I think this is, but how to deal with that familiarity, I think, is beautifully captured in Randy's group name, knowing, not knowing, and unknowing. Which sounds to my ears that thinking about the collaborative processes, all three had to happen at the same time. It is not a staged thing, so we don't go from knowing to not knowing to unknowing. We are having and experiencing all of those things at the same time. And I think David will probably can speak to that also. Every time we were having these conversations about emergence, or in our group, we were holding back our knowledges. We were coming in with not knowing, but at the same time knowing, but also at the same time trying to unknown something so that a new thing can emerge, which I think was interesting. But if I want to talk about this notion of familiarity in more philosophical terms, I think it's a minor concept. And when I say minor, I am referring to Isabel Stengers, who uses it in reference to Deleuze, and from which Brian Masumi and Erin Manning takes. They try to adopt it in multiple collaborative experiments, including scholars, artists, and scientists. A minor concept does not mean that the concept itself is unimportant. Okay? It does not mean that it's negligible or it is irrelevant to us. It is a concept that actually enables different practices to create an ecology. And when I say ecology, I'm looking around if Sadira was here because we are obsessed with Isabel Stengers' one article we teach almost every year. It's called Introduction to an Ecology of Practices. It's by Isabel Stengers, and there she defines the notion of the minor concept and the minor key, which is that it's a concept that allows us to think, what she says par le milieu, to think about both the in-between and also the habitat itself. So, and the minor concept is opposed to the major concept, and the major concept you can think about as the Anthropocene. Let's say, and if you want to talk about the Anthropocene, then everybody starts talking about whatever is going around and all the discourses that are lying around. However, a minor concept, because it does not yet have the circulation, it actually allows people to, or it allows different disciplines and it allows different expertises to engage in a conversation. So I think emergence also was a minor concept that did allow this kind of a very creative collaboration to emerge. And this is, again, not to say that obviously it is very important and it is it's a foundational concept for sociology. It is the question of sociology. It is one of the big questions of physics, as I understand, and definitely of political philosophy, especially if we think about emergence as an event, again in a very Deleuzian sense, and also as a rearrangement of all the patterns, which I will come in a little while. So it is within this familiarity and within this conduciveness of the concept of emergence to all the practices, I think something new has emerged. And this is not very much apparent usually in interdisciplinary projects. Interdisciplinary projects are supposed to bring in something new, and they are supposed to generate something new. But first of all, what usually goes around under interdisciplinarity is multidisciplinarity, where everybody brings their own expertise in, where there's a division of labor between different experts, and the division of labor between different experts has nothing to do with not knowing or unknowing. And there's nothing, no readiness to unknow. It is on the contrary, everyone in a multidisciplinary project is there through their expertise and through what they know best. So in interdisciplinarity, again, I'm looking at Sadira and Simon, who are not here because it was Simon at the last translation hub who reminded us of Althusser and his conceptualization of interdisciplinarity, which is most interesting because Althusser says that if there's a true interdisciplinary work, then what happens is that there's something new that emerges. And he says that it's the emergence of a new object, because he defines the discipline or any expertise as the creation of an object. Now, I think that we are long past that period where we can talk about objects, but I think that, again, what emerged from this exhibition, a new dimension of emergence, which points to, as I said before, the spatial dimension of the concept itself. Now I'm going to try a little bit of what I think that spatial element and that topological element is. And I would like to do it by speaking to some of the artworks here and try to think them in terms of these topological or these spatial categories. And I will talk about basically 3 points, and then I will leave the floor to my colleagues. First of all, another Deleuzian scholar, John Portavy, who actually is someone who writes about emergence. What he said in relation to creative processes is that, first of all, whenever we're thinking about creativity, we're thinking about actually a diachronic emergence, an emergence that happens over a long time, which is a repatterning of the system. It is not triggered by an external event, nor does it emerge suddenly. So it is a reshuffling of patterns and thresholds, is what he's saying. And it is, so this notion of the patterns and the thresholds is what I see when I look at Sarah-Jean Bourget's Inside the Bubble Chamber, of patterning. Also Marion Candler Bancroft's, both oscillation, mixing, and interference, 3 beautiful photographs, together with the rifting of Pangea as a creation of, or as this emergence of the patterns that emerge over a long time. And I know that, for instance, Marion did that in relation to the neutrinos, and I think that there is something about, I'm going to shy away from talking about neutrinos, obviously, among all these physicists. But definitely over a long time, and the pattern and the way of observation is telling me that it is related to the patterns and the photographs themselves. If you haven't seen them already, please go and see. The beautiful, you see how the shadows are actually extending over lines, and they are telling us about the thresholds and the patterns. Now, if we talk about repatterning and the Deleuzian topology of emergence and creative processes, then the second point is that we are immediately implying that they do take place on a flat surface, where heterogeneous components actually could exist. Right? These things that we cannot never put together actually do exist on a flat surface. And that is one of the, I think, most creative aspects of a Deleuzian ontology, and also one of the most revolutionary aspects of it, because it does allow new things to happen, and it does allow the event, in whichever way we define it, to emerge. And when I look at, and when I think about the flat surfaces, and how new creativity is there, I'm thinking about Theo Monsal's figures, the time transfer events, where the particle images produced by the Hadron Collider could encounter indigenous profiles. And I'm using encounter here on purpose. Not because, first of all, I'm speaking at a panel titled Emergence and Encountering Emergence, but also because encounter refers to the capacities of the bodies to be affected. I don't know if we can read, for instance, Vanessa Lowell's event display as depicting an encounter, but again, surely the neutrino explosion and the grid could be said to be sharing the same flat surface. Not the event itself is taking place, not the explosion is taking place on the grid, but the grid and the explosion are actually sharing the same flat surface. And again, to go with the same conceptual concept of constellation, it is one smooth space next to a striated space. And again, if we are going to talk about the heterogeneous elements finding their ways into the same space, into the same flat surface, I think Jacqueline Turner's Limiting Infinity is the poetry, is a beautiful explanation, is a beautiful depiction of this new topology. And I'm just going to quote Ingrid here, because she said it beautifully when she was giving us the curatorial tour. A couple of days ago, she said, poetry allowed for the space of not knowing to emerge. So it is there as a space, and you can see it. And the final, my final point, and this is the third one, and this is somehow also related to my own expertise, my own field or practice.
Sorry,
Sorry, the light just went up.
It's fine.
It sensed the fire. It does this.
Oh, it does.
Nice. Okay. So finally, emergence in Foucault and Nietzsche is a concept that belongs to the interstices. And they do define that interstice not as a stage, a space, or not as a stage, but as a void, which has no directions and coordinates, but has infinite dimensions that can be stretched in any way. And the classical color of the void, the black, is there, and I'm just seeing it now in Christine Donofrio's piece. The black background does not display various objects, but the objects dance the blackness into existence. They do not have fun on a space, but they dance the space into being. Which I think is similar to Robin Gleason's work, Possibilities, with the found concrete pieces from Triumph. Not only does the white board that they lay over, and it's not that they lay over, but matches the black, I think, in Donofrio, black and white being the two main colors of the void. But also the particles and the way that they're arranged in an explosive pattern define the board itself. And because they're an explosive pattern, they also speak to Vanessa Lowe's explosion and back to the flat surface. And as for our contribution, and I'm just going to say this and then leave it, I think also for me, what I see there after we did the installation was suspension and the emergence and the relation of emergence to suspension. Suspension of everything, so that there is the floor that is left open, and it is the emergence is telling me or asking me how to conceptualize that floor as a topology or as a spatial metaphor that has all these dimensions, but at the same time it is referring to a certain void. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell me when you want to.
So the next speaker is David Morrissey, and one thing I just want to mention, and when we had our communications around the panels, we sent them certain questions and had a back and forth of these two questions that you would like to use to talk about, to frame how you would your presentation. And so some of the questions, for example, for David, were what comes up for you in the first encounter with the whole fabric of artworks. And this is something that Sanem has spoken to. What are your thoughts on the physicist's contributions onto the process? How are you thinking about emergence as an underlying concept for scientific collaboration? And how can we improve the methodology to generate stronger results and conclusions? So then it's up to David to pick what he wants to talk about. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me. It's Mike.
Yes.
Very good. I'll try not to stand too close to it. So, yeah, thank you for all coming here. I suspect I have quite a different training and background relative to the other panelists. I think possibly, I don't want to say a different perspective, but maybe a different perspective. Not necessarily dogma, but so I do theoretical particle physics. So I do particle physics, which means my day job, my night job too, the thing I'm really interested in, the thing I'm fascinated in, is trying to figure out the fundamental building blocks of all the stuff around us and how those building blocks work with each other, interact, and so on. In this sense, I'm a radical reductionist, the very opposite of emergence. I'll come back to emergence in the scientific context in a second. But to some extent, what I do is the very opposite of emergence. Trying to break down things into their very smallest components, and figure out what those components are, And then maybe once we have that, we can go back and build up and figure out how the bigger world around us works. I think Jess may have been messing with us a bit, as part of the physicists a bit, when proposing emergence, but I should say that even though what I try to study, what I try to get into, are these basic building blocks, emergence is forced on me. It's not something I can get around. It's something I have to live with and in some sense embrace. And that comes from experiments. So I may have a wonderful theory of elementary particles, but my theory is useless unless it can explain what experiments do. And when you do an experiment, you can't just get a single building block. You have to look at the building block as it interacts with everything else in a kind of a big, what we call macroscopic concept. So I'm interested in the microscopic, but we have to live with the bigger macroscopic, kind of human-sized stuff to understand and to test our theories. And even though I may be taking an overly reductionist point of view, or my goal is reductionist, I still have to live in the context of emergence and deal with it and appreciate it and try to connect it with things. So getting back to the discussion points and the questions that Ingrid sent around, I guess I wanted to start off with emergence and the pieces and I guess my experience with them and reaction to them. So let me first say that emergence for scientists, or in the scientific context, emergence means something very specific that is not necessarily the same thing that emergence means to people more general. So this is true of a lot of words. In science, we have words that sound like everyday words, but for us, they mean something very, very specific. In the case of emergence, it means that you start typically with a simple set of building blocks, and the thing that comes out is hugely complicated, and in fact, it's so hugely complicated that we don't necessarily know how to get the hugely complicated output from the simple input. So from my reductionist point of view, my particle physics point of view, this is scary. Emergence is kind of what happens when we lose control. And I think this touches nicely on the looking at a Windows concept. Emergence, though, is it's all over the place in physics. Like I said, it's not something you can get around. If you want to understand the world around us, you have to live with emergence. You have to deal with it. One thing that I'm going to come back to a lot is dark matter. If you haven't heard of dark matter, don't worry. I'll say a few things, but I don't want to be overly prescriptive. My tendency. But dark matter does give us one example of emergence, and I'll show you some images in a second. But more generally, we have all these. The thing that really struck me about the works is that just starting from what I argue is the simple concept of emergence, something that seems familiar, across fields. Starting from a simple starting point, we have as an output this huge diverse range of pieces. And this huge diverse range of pieces is not something you can predict from the input. And this is really what emergence means in the scientific context. You think you start off in a simple place, where you end up is something you can't predict, something you don't know how to get there, you don't know how you got there, but you got there, and in this case it's wonderful. Could I flip through a few slides? Oh, sorry, this is just the contractually obligated intro slide. If you go to the first, maybe second. Okay, so one thing I did part of my work, trying to understand the elementary building blocks, is to try to figure out what theories of these elementary building blocks imply for the structure of the universe, the stuff we can see, over the largest distances we can possibly see. So this is connecting elementary particles to cosmology. And what we get from this, what we find, if you run the movie of the evolution of the universe starting from very early to today, is a beautiful example of emergence. If you look way, way back in time, the early universe is basically a hot soup of stuff. So the picture on the left, it's a hot soup, and it's an amazingly uniform hot soup. And what I mean by that is any one place is almost precisely exactly the same as any other place. It's almost maximally boring. But you let this thing, it's true, it's almost maximally boring. But you let the universe evolve, and it does its thing, it cools off and expands and so on. And what you end up with today is something that's very complicated. This image on the right is a Hubble Deep Field Telescope photograph of many, many galaxies. So a galaxy is a collection of stars all clumped together gravitationally. And instead of having the same thing everywhere, you see there's a lot of empty space, but then there are these very concentrated galaxies. And within each galaxy, you have even more concentrated stars, and around the stars, planets, and possibly us, or beings surrounding stars. If you just go forward one more thing. Okay, so I'm going to say something very quickly about dark matter. And this also reflects on our piece. Okay, we're on the Earth, we're going around the Sun, that's a star. Stars are generally collecting galaxies. So we're in a galaxy called the Milky Way. Galaxies themselves group up with different galaxies called galaxy clusters. But if you keep on zooming out, the structure of the distribution of stuff in the universe is very non-uniform, and it takes this structure of what we call filaments and voids. So the image on the very far right are what we call filaments and voids. This isn't an actual picture. This is a simulation of how galaxies form. But the image on the right shows that the bright stuff are galaxies or galaxy clusters, and then in between the galaxy clusters you have these big, huge voids. Now, to get this structure, to get this filament and void structure, it turns out that the elementary building blocks that we've managed to discover so far, the things we've seen in the lab, aren't enough. You need something more. And that something more that you need to get this filaments and void structure turns out to be dark matter. Our best bet is dark matter is an elementary particle, but dark matter is contributing in an essential way. This little fundamental building block is contributing in an essential way to building up this emergent structure of filaments and voids that describes the large-scale structure of the universe today. So a big part of my research is trying to figure out what this filament and void structure is. And this picture of filaments and voids was, at least for me, part of the background that went into our piece. So I can go on and on about dark matter, but I'll move on. I was asked to talk about emergence and how it connected to our, well, I guess, my work. And I'll specifically say my work as a scientist. And I guess how the collaboration impacts my work. Well, so first of all, for me, working with Sanem and Emma and Holly was enormously fun. I had a great time. We all spoke different languages. We all came from very, very different perspectives, but I think we managed to meet in a way where we all made interesting, useful contributions, and I think we all got a taste or flavor of the other person's universe. Now, having said that, even though our backgrounds and languages are often very different, the way we operate, the way we go about our practices, I find that they have lots and lots of parallels. Even though our approach is different, in many cases we have an idea, we have some technical ability, and to express idea or to convey the idea, you have to put those together. So our background training and our technical skills might be different, but still the way our practice works, in just about on every element, I see one-to-one parallels. And that part was very interesting. But because we speak these very different languages, and we have these broad backgrounds, it's also a bit challenging, I think, for all of us to figure out how to communicate with each other. We speak different languages. And I found it's a wonderful mental exercise, a mental challenge, trying to connect where I'm coming from with where they're coming from, and seeing the artists and the scholars do the same thing, going, I don't say the other way, but really the same thing. But connected to that, I should say that as far as doing science goes, science is a hugely social and collaborative pursuit. It's not just some lone genius locked in a closet, locked in an attic somewhere, having wonderful ideas. It's really, the progress of the field really goes through collaboration, group dynamics, and so on. And as part of that, communicating and explaining ideas and transferring them is an essential part. And one thing I got out of this, I got lots of stuff out of this, but one thing I got out of this is helping me communicate better to people within my own discipline, and hopefully people across the discipline. Brought you a dark already. Okay, so actually this is another picture of a simulation of cosmic structure. Again, it's showing emergence. Up in the upper right, this is a galaxy cluster, so all those little dots are galaxies on their own. And you zoom out, and you get the filaments and voids structure. But I'm sorry, if you flip back, great. Okay, so in a nutshell, this is how science works. So I want to talk a bit about collaboration, but this is a probably overly reductionist picture of how science works. I think I'm reductionist. I do theory. So my job is to take measurements done by experiments and to make predictions. And my predictions go off, and hopefully they're tested in an experiment. And if my predictions work, then my theory is a good one. If my predictions don't work, it's not a good theory, and I have to throw it out. I'm sad, but I move on to try to do better ones. But then with new data, they have new discoveries, new so on, so I have to go and work on a new theory and so on. So the way science works, in a nutshell, at least as far as I see it, is really this I don't want to say virtuous circle, it's kind of, but virtuous circle of theory and experiment, trading experiment and predictions going back and forth. I don't have a similar collaboration diagram for our group, but something similar happened. And we had a very good circular, very good back and forth, connecting the pieces. In terms of how to optimize the interaction between scientists and artists, I don't know. But I felt that the group we had was wonderful. I think it really comes down to the people in the group and the willingness to maybe take chances and so on. But I had a wonderful time learning from you and talking with you and then Ollie and Emma. Just to say a couple of last things. As part of the installation, I got to go up on the scissor lift and tie knots and stitch things. I got my hands dirty. It's wonderful. But one thing that kept on coming up within our group, and we all came to it from a different place, were tentacles and octopuses. So for me, one thing that brings to mind tentacles is this picture of filaments and voids, where you have these clusters of galaxies or super galaxy clusters, and then these filaments reaching out all over the place. So for me, very good. This image of tentacles coming out of a node and connecting with other tentacles came to mind. Now, the other members of the group came to the octopus from very different places and from very different background images. In fact, this picture is maybe a good representation of how we worked as a group. We have lots of ideas, reaching out and connecting in many, many ways. Just two last things about octopuses. I saw octopus come up on, I forget the name of the artist. Octopuses came out elsewhere.
Theo?
Yes.
Yeah.
And finally, I just learned this. Apparently octopuses essentially have 3 hearts and 9 brains. So an octopus has a central brain, plus a kind of a neural cluster, like a little mini brain, essentially attached to each arm. I hate to say, I also learned that apparently octopus arms are arms and not tentacles, but I believe that. And finally, they have 3 hearts, so maybe that makes me a heartless scientist if you're not. But in any case, I had a wonderful time, and thank you, Sanem. Thank you, Ingrid and venc.
Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
I just want to add, and after the first round working with antimatter, and when we went back to the scientists and said this is what happened with all of your production, and a lot of them said we want to get our hands dirty, we want to go into the studio next time around. So we were really excited to be able to design a process that allowed for that. So I turn it now to Kimberly Phillips, and again we had questions for her about what up for her in the first encounter with all of the works? Do you think your works are connected to each other? Are you thinking about emergence as an underlying concept? How are you thinking about emergence as an underlying concept for artistic collaboration? And can you contextualize the project historically or within a contemporary art world?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I want to say, first of all, I'm really privileged to be here. I've been following this project. I mean, unlike the two of you, I haven't been involved in the inside of this project, but I've been a really close observer of it from its inception. And I think it's a really brave and wonderful collaborative venture in and of itself. And I was particularly interested to come here today, like under the umbrella of emergence, because the term emergent and emergence is one I spent some time thinking about in my own context, in my work. Before my current position, I was director-curator of an artist-run center called Access Gallery, a small center that has a mandate to focus or committed to experimental and emergent practices. And that term is a mushy term at best in the art community. And I thought it was really interesting to spend time thinking about what that term meant for me and how do I actualize it. So it's actually, you two talk about this in your, at the end of this brief a little bit, but I'm always quite interested in, often my thinking starts from language and etymologies and things like that. And the term emergent is one that, in its oldest sort of form, when it first shows up in Old English, it describes something that is moving through a medium and coming into visibility. And that moment of coming into visibility is something that was unexpected and sometimes astonishing, but in any case, it was always deserving of attention. And something that really turned me on about the term was that emergence and emergent is linked etymologically then to the word emergency, which again in its earlier form didn't necessarily convey some of the horror that we might associate with it today, but an emergency is simply anything that arrests one's attention and demands that attention. And I was really excited by thinking about artistic practice and artistic work as something which moves through a medium to come into some visibility, and that struggle to move through that medium. And then it's really interesting that you were focusing on the spatial aspects of emergence, because that's something that's exactly how I've been thinking about it. And then it arrests your attention and requires our attention. And as somebody who, as a curator, it's that this teaching of attention and a kind of call from all of us, or from those practitioners wishing to bring a public, create a public, and bring that in front of the work. That is a really interesting thing, important thing to me, that in fact now we're all involved, we are interpolated into this process. So in the context of being out of windows, I was always really, in some ways maybe it's self-evident that you would want to bring all of these findings and these processes into a kind of public context, into an exhibition context, but in a way it wasn't necessarily wasn't necessarily something you had to do. And of course, we maybe as practitioners who work with art and in a context where exhibitions happen a lot, maybe this is self-evident, but I actually am interested in how the decision to do that and actually calls a public into being, creates a public, it's a mode of publishing, and asks us to take part in that process and to fold ourselves in. And there's something quite special, I think, that happened in this exhibition for me. And again, I think it touches a little bit on what you saw, which is very different from the first phase of the project, which felt a little bit more iterative to me, or singular in the sense of each artist was responding to a set of ideas, a set of terms. Whereas this time around, I do get quite a different sense of intra-action, to bring out Karen Barad's idea that there is interaction sort of presupposes that, there are these distinct and discrete kind of fully formed elements that then come together, but intra-action suggests instead that there are no discrete formed anything, like we are constantly in the process of coming into form with and alongside others. So, being in the world is always being with, and I think that in some ways for me, this exhibition comes close to trying to articulate what that being with is, if that makes any sense. So in terms of emergence and its relationship to collaboration, I have lots of questions for this project about, I'm happy to hear you, David, when you're talking about like what the project meant for you, and from the scientific perspective, what was their experience and what they took away, or how did they feel challenged in some ways differently or similarly to the artists who are offered a kind of completely new context in which to make work or respond. And I mean, I approach, I think of all artistic practices as that which, as opposed to maybe scientists who are trying to, as you say, find out, understand the building blocks of the universe that we live in. Artists, I always think of artists as working to try to bring form to the questions, not necessarily finding the answers, but it's the questions. So I feel like the Emergence exhibition and this process seems to have found a way to develop those questions with one another differently for me than your first phase. The notion of collaboration, I think, is one which at its core involves risk, and it has to involve risk, otherwise it's not truly collaborative. And I think to place oneself in a kind of uncomfortable or unfamiliar situation is the only way. I mean, you must do that in order to open yourself to the possibility that something different, a third thing may arise out of the parts that are already in existence. I think in my work, I've been working with a number of artists, actually, incidentally, with a number of artists who are thinking about collaboration. And I think from my own research, you approach it from, if I think about, answering that question of like, if we can place this in some sort of context, like what are some other projects that are, or artistic practices that rely on collaboration or have propelled themselves to that. I think about many historic kind of women's practices, many of whose practices are not actually known, and because they are operating in, because many women are dealing with many different types of labors at the same time, artistic labor, but also reproductive labors, physical labors, emotional labors, etc. And because there is an inability and no need to separate those modes from one another, they have to find really inventive, often very collaborative ways of getting things done so that you can still make work. And I think because of these different, very intra-disciplinary ways of working, maybe, the canon, of art history, I'm thinking of a Western canon here, has in many cases failed to recognize or even see those practices because they do not register on the terrain, right? They don't follow a kind of singular kind of patriarchal model of authorship, and they, in order to actually find their way through, they do away with that, or they resist it or challenge it. So I'm interested in some ways I see a desire or a kind of, a desire in Meeting on Windows as a whole, in its macro sense, as wishing to find other ways of being and of making in the world, and of finding ways to make utterances. Because it seems to me that, you collaborate because, in the best sense, because the ways of doing it otherwise are unsatisfactory and are no longer interesting, or they don't get you very far. I think we're living in a context now where is a kind of a crisis context, and a kind of siloed way of thinking and way of moving in the world, you know, again, as our sort of capitalist patriarchal system has allowed us to, or has shaped for us, you know, because power likes to conglomerate, and so people keeping their, disciplines keeping their own knowledge is separate, and we've now realized that this is not really functional, and it's not getting us, we're going to quickly lose our world, I think, and thinking of the physical one and environmentally, but also ethically, I think. So perhaps when I look at this project, I see a desire, and as I say, I sort of register that same desire in some historical women working together, but also some contemporary artists too, who are trying to find different ways of authoring together, because it's really the only way forward. One artist I'm thinking of now, who I would love to see how she would respond to this project, is Althea Tauberger, who's somebody I'm working with. She has a filmic and photographic practice, and she tends to create these large scale productions, like film productions, in contexts which are really fraught, politically and historically speaking. But in order to do that, and also because she's sort of an outsider in these contexts, she will gather together a community known to that, but local to that context, and the project gets built together with others. So it is not really her project. It is a project that is for and with the people who are of that context. And I've always, I find a similar spirit of and underlying politics as to Leaning Out of Windows, in the sense of, like, you know, it's a mode of challenging a set of assumptions about how authorship happens and where value lies. And for me, some of the most exciting moments in this exhibition, I was excited to see some of the artists that I know very well, whose work I know really well, Marion Kenner-Bancroft, I'm thinking of you, for example, and to see how you responded to the terms, the terrain that was that you explored, and now, but it was as much me reading your work differently through this context as it was you pushing to make a new kind of work. So that goes back to this notion of, like, how this is for us and calling into existence a public. It's like, maybe it's just as much about us bringing, like, opening our eyes to look at not only the artwork differently, but our own way of grappling with the world. So I think that's, for me, that's one of the things of this project. It's one of the legacies, maybe, of this project that I think would be really interesting to track. But then, you know, so there are some artworks that I was really excited to see how these artists responded to these new set of terms. But then there were projects like yours, or groups like yours, where there was quite literally a kind of collaborative effort to bring something new into the world that wouldn't have happened, wouldn't have come about by any of the participants individually. And whether or not we see those as successful artworks, it's not really of interest to me, actually. It's more, it's more a demonstration of how, you know, we might approach an idea of interaction, I think. Let me see, what else can I say about this? I think maybe I'll leave it there. I was thinking quite a bit about Karen Barad the whole time I was wandering through this show, and some of her concepts which have propelled me. But I hope we have time for some questions, because I would love to kind of hear further whether or not, still at base, this is a project which is for an artistic community, in that it opens a window, and we lean out into a medium that we're already a part of, but that we now have a sort of different set of devices or tools with which to grapple with it, or for the physicists involved in a true collaborative sense, is it also doing that for them, and what does that look like? And you spoke a little bit to that in terms of, like, how maybe it's altered how you communicate, David, in terms of your own work, but in some ways, I think artistic practices are always doing this. We're always, hopefully, in leading out of windows in order to learn, like, ways to bring form and shape to the medium that we're moving through. And in a sense, like, I think physicists are also at work doing this, trying to find those answers and, like, name those things. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
audience, and if you have particular questions or pick up on some of the things we've heard.
A lot to assemble.
Somebody in the back.
Jess. Yeah, Jess.
Did you have fun? That's a question I would like to know the answer to. I mean, we had a lot of fun. We can hear you. I was just like to know whether you had fun.
Yes.
We had lots of fun in our group.
Oh yeah, we had so much laughter. Probably, like, we were laughing the whole time. So this is, I don't know how it speaks to the seriousness of the work itself, but we definitely had amazing fun, no?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that.
Yeah.
We had a great time. We spent a good amount of time in Dresso looking for
The mesh.
but even better are our discussions. We covered a lot of ground for the start, but I had a great time.
Yeah, likewise.
I would just say also, we had fun. I was in Jess's group, and part of that fun, to describe the quality of it, was a kind of giddiness. And that giddiness was because we didn't know what was going on. So the fun was pure pleasure, I think, and getting to know people and how interesting they were and what they had to offer, but also all of us, I think, were prepared to let go of our own practices to see what would form. And for me, there was a kind of laughter, but that laughter was a kind of discomfort, which I think you've described in the sense that if you're not uncomfortable, then what's actually happening here? So I think it's kind of interesting to describe the quality of that pleasure, or the quality of that fun. And that giddiness also makes me think about, when I think about the cosmos, or the origin of the cosmos, and start to understand that it's 4.5 billion years old, and some of the images that David describes, that also makes me giddy. Like I'm excited, but I'm also uncomfortable because I know I don't understand it, and it's not understandable, right? So yeah, I just want to add that. Any other questions?
And, more comments.
Well, I think this does morph itself into a question. I think if I could pose maybe 2 questions. The first for David. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on emergence in relation to your work in theoretical physics. I was really grabbed by you being very honest about the challenges of having to work with emergence in physics, because if you're a radical reductionist and then having laid out the building blocks and then seeing it happen in experiments and them having relationships that were totally unpredicted when you characterize them as building blocks. Do you theorize what that relationship will be when those building blocks come together? Like, how do you theorize the emergence that might happen once it goes into an experiment? Do you kind of know what I mean? Like, if emergence happens, how do you theorize what could emerge? And my second question is for Kimberly. From an art historical perspective, I was really drawn by the way in which you contextualize the notion of emergence. I was wondering if you could also contextualize a little bit the practice of artists collaborating with scientists itself within the history of art, and how this, I don't know if I can call it a genre, maybe that's too strong, this practice, perhaps, the various times historically in which it has emerged, and perhaps the politics of this practice a little bit, if that's something within your field of expertise. Thanks.
Maybe I'll go first. So a great example of emergence for me is the strong interaction, the thing that holds atomic nuclei together. So there we have a theory for it, and we have a theory for the fundamental parts of it, the basic building blocks. And we're almost completely certain that it's a very fundamental theory. We've tested it in a lot of ways, it works great. But when it comes to making predictions with a theory, even though we have a wonderful theory, I could break it down in about 2 lines. We have a bunch of equations. We don't know how to take this theory and make predictions with it. except through large-scale computer simulations. So usually by the time you're doing large-scale computer simulations, that means you don't have control over the thing, you don't know how to deal with it analytically. And this is one example, and when this kind of thing has to happen, the story is that you have your building blocks, and those building blocks are all pretty much independent. You can treat them as sort of uncoupled to each other. They don't talk to each other too much. And you can treat them to a good approximation as being independent things. Then you can do very simple, very good theoretical predictions. That works great. But when those individual components start talking to each other a lot, that's when you totally lose control. That's when your life becomes a lot more difficult and emergence comes out. So it's really going from this so-called weakly coupled regime where you have the individual pieces don't talk to each other too much, to the strongly coupled one that you see emergence happen. At least within my realm, this is how it comes about. And I'll leave it to you to find lots of analogies to.
That's a good question. It's definitely not in my field of expertise, but I have maybe a few thoughts that I could offer. One is that I'm kind of interested, I'm thinking here again a bit deeply in unfortunately sort of very Western context in which I'm working in, but I'm thinking of moments in art history where what we would understand now as like art and science as two discrete sort of knowledge practices. There's moments where that wasn't the case. Like, you know, before there was like science as differentiated from other things. There was a kind of set of pursuits which were completely entangled with one another. And I'm thinking of obvious things like, Leonardo da Vinci's experiments and all of there's a whole huge realm of workers and thinkers around in that context before even natural science becomes sort of codified as something which has to be mapped out differently and against something else, right? So we see these sort of philosophies of knowledge start to split off. And that's kind of interesting in terms of how diagrammatics and how visual imagery or form is used to bring life to the questions of the universe, undifferentiated in terms of art and science. And then there's this then you get a moment where those things start to split off, and then how, if you look at some, again, very canonical sort of artworks or artists who are begin to respond to a kind of a nascent science practice. I'm thinking about people like Joseph Wright of Derby, for example, who make these ginormous sort of history paintings, which brought a visual language that sort of described a kind of moment of scientific discovery, and it begins to epistemologically it begins to kind of articulate what knowledge and what truth and what science is. So art begins to have a different kind of role, which is to kind of articulate and kind of codify and literally bring into form a set of things which are defined as science. So that's kind of an interesting moment. But then if you go, I was thinking about like the history of 20th century art. There's all kinds of ways in which artists are working outside or leading out of their own windows, so to speak. And I think like the history of the avant-garde, especially like for example the surrealists or other folks who are concerned with like politically or ideologically the terms by which they are constrained or understood as artists or thinkers are not going to bring about any change. So you have to sort of undermine the status quo and seek out ways that disrupt or make uncomfortable anyone who's approaching it from a very founded disciplinary context. And then in contemporary work we see so many artists who are working across boundaries. And again, in my view, it feels like it's because we no longer, like to continue to bound ourselves is death in a way. Like it's not appropriate ethically or politically to stay in your own lane in that manner, because the questions that we have are becoming more and more urgent, and maybe you can only do that well or egotistically with others, with who actually challenge your own presumptions. So I think in that sense, you know, working with contemporary artists, like I'm quite interested in how artists navigate that discomfort, and seem to be drawn to practices that are doing that. Is that a partial answer?
It's more of a comment or actually a question for my own group, which I happen to be sitting with, so you guys should be paying attention. And it is following from both what Kimberly said and Sanem in terms of familiarity, and what Kimberly was talking about in terms of this idea of engaging with the new, something on the other side and leaning out of windows. My own experiences felt a little bit strained because I came to the project already being somewhere in the middle. And from what you're talking to Sanem about familiarity, I was starting to think that my familiarity was actually a barrier for collaboration rather than an enabler. And so that's what I'm curious whether my group agrees in my that thought, whether I was holding on to something, I was holding things back because of some degree of literacy. So that's a comment and a question. And so the question is, where's the place for the in-between where there's already, you're already not on either side? I don't know. I feel pretty lost.
Well, I mean, so for me also, that when I started thinking about it, familiarity definitely is a concept that I definitely do not like. I love to be unfamiliar, or that uncertainty is much more productive to collaboration and to creative processes than familiarity, because familiarity holds us back on many things, and it makes us take things for granted, right? But I think here, the familiarity that I'm talking about is the familiarity which is the familiarity of the minor, which is that you are somewhere in between. You definitely are, you don't know, but you have a sense of it. And if we think about also familiarity in an incredibly Freudian, the uncanny way, right? There's the familiarity and unfamiliarity together in that. So the notion of emergence, because it brings it with it all these things coming into visibility with unexpected, brilliant point, I think, and the thing that demands our attention, the thing that snatches actually our attention and imposes itself on us, is both familiar and unfamiliar, I think, which is that the notion of the uncanny or the uncanny there. So I mean, but on the other hand, what is the place in between? I think it's a question that we can ask now, because I think right now the in-between is visible. Maybe before it was not that invisible, it was a little bit blurred, but I think it is there now. So we can start thinking about the interstices, we can start thinking about that topology.
I think that's really, I love that you just brought in Heimlich. I think that it's a really wonderful way of analyzing this deep discomfort of the almost familiar, or the formerly familiar, the forgotten familiar. The weird. Yeah, the weird.
This makes me think about the whole process design, and how when we bring groups together at Triumph for the seminar, and I think maybe we can learn, this is a question I think we asked David, of what we can do better in terms of bringing people together in this methodology, is maybe we could do more work in pointing to this idea of the familiar, the unfamiliar, or maybe even introducing the idea of the uncanny, and talking about it in terms of what's being asked of each individual, is not just to be there from within their respective fields, but also in terms of a sense of maybe something might shift in their own practices, and something might shift in their collaborative engagements, and something might shift because of this interdisciplinary movement. And I think a lot of it is about movement. So in terms of talking about process design and how we work with artists and scientists and scholars, is the idea of movement, that something will move, something, well, I think you talked about that something will shift, and you won't, sometimes maybe you won't even know it's shifting, or maybe you'll know because you're uncomfortable. But it's that idea of maybe we need to highlight discomfort more. Maybe we need to highlight, the in-between sort of sounds like a concept that I can hold on to, but it's the idea of being presented with something that something will unfold and you don't know what it is, and you know, in terms of what Ben's asking for is a kind of understanding that you will be moved, you will be shaken in some way, and to invite that in.
Yeah, when we did the first round of antimatter, it was actually Triumph that did the coupling, thinking, so, okay, this artist works with light, so, oh, that person there is researching light in physics, and so trying to bring that kind of a connection and partnering, and in some cases that really worked, but you know, it wasn't necessarily that common thing was then the thing that brought them together, so then one of the artists, for example, had a lot of trouble having conversations with her physicist and always trying to figure out, well, how, no, this question isn't working, this isn't working. And then she, as Randy likes to say, she kind of stalked him and realized he online and realized he loved cat videos. And so that was a place, you know, this other kind of place that she could actually enter and bring this up. And it was the place that opened that up for them, and they started to do collaborative drawings, and the humor came in. So these clusterings don't always work the way you think they will. And this time around, again, it was a group kind of designing of thinking, well, what gels, but also trying to bring in a variety of disciplines so that even within the arts, you have people working with different kinds of materialities and background knowledges that are being put together. I just want to quote one scientist, Carr who says that it's not about getting things right, it's about the conversations. So, but if it's about the conversations, but yes, they may also be uncomfortable and there may be friction and so on, and that is part of it.
I think also I'm thinking about one of our artists in, we give out a survey to the artists and the physicists and the scholars and ask questions, and one of the artists, a few of them described it as a social experiment, that the whole thing was a kind of unfamiliar social experiment, and so it was about conversation, and it was about the kind of the desire in the end to make work, but I think it was also the kind of a social experiment because we are socialized differently. I mean, I really appreciate David saying that science is about collaboration, it is about a social engagement, and in some ways art can be quite isolating for the artist who's alone in their studio. So in that sense, I think maybe the physicist might be more comfortable in this collaborative endeavor, and the artist might be challenged.
Thank you for all your stimulating thoughts. My head is kind of spinning, and I want to comment on one aspect that you, Kimberly, mentioned that I really found very intriguing in terms of interdisciplinary practices. If you want to contextualize collaboration in the arts historically, to actually think of women's practices as this multitasking projects of emotional labor, reproductive labor, artistic labor, and so on. So I found that very stimulating, and I kind of want to bridge that if we think about collaboration historically, that it probably also appeared historically in this context of democratizing the society. So surrealist experimentations with collaboration, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century is when actually in the Western world democracy was, and monarchy was abolished and democracy was installed. And what I want to say is that also this desire to actually merge life and art probably also has to do, from my perspective at least, to kind of circumvent market, let's say the market context, which puts arts into this context of commercialization. and the market logic. So when we as artists collaborate, we also do not produce results that are, you know, for sale, but they have a deeper meaning. And with the art and science collaboration, however, and it's the question that I want to put out here maybe more critically is, since we enter a phase also in neoliberal capitalism where creativity becomes a source for extraction too, and these kind of collaborations between different sectors also become a space to, you know, almost as a resource, so that, for example, for physics, you know, we kind of extract the creativity of a lot of people or artists in order to create something then later that plays a role in this kind of industrial setting that also physics, for example, and the sciences are embedded in. So that's just on a critical segment.
Hi, I just wanted to thank all of you for such a really wonderful sort of conversation and discussion, and there's a lot of points to talk about, clearly. But the sort of question that I have is mostly for Sanem and David, because you both were part of the same group. And one of the things that I was really struck by your piece is the rope that wraps around the pole. Sanem, I know you and I sort of talked about it, because to me, I was really overcome by looking at this rope that's staying in place. And, you know, for what we understand with gravity, that rope should not be, you know, separated as it wraps around the pole, but yet it is. And it wasn't until you showed me the sort of ingeniousness of wrapping the rope with the mesh that creates a sense of friction that holds the rope in place on a pole, defying gravity to a certain extent. And seeing that, and then listening to you sort of both talking about this sort of idea of the sort of in-between, this interstitial space and this minor concept, it kind of got me thinking about how you both in your group navigated the sort of your own sort of personal agency within that space, as well as having to kind of abandon it and create sort of this new language that to me is very much sort of visualized in the rope mesh. And I'm just curious about how your group worked together and how you sort of developed this sort of alternative language within that in-between space, while also navigating your own sort of individual agencies.
So actually, specifically about the rope staying up, I spent a fair bit of time Googling how to tie knots. And they're also stitched together with fishing line, so you can't see it. But one thing that I think that Sanem pointed out, that it's also in the piece that was didn't say explicitly, when you take a rope and you put weights on it, it takes a certain shape, called a catenary. And this is a balance between the tension in the rope and the pull of gravity down. It's something like it's reflected in our piece. It's one of the elements built in. It's, I guess it's a mathematical and scientific concept that brought into it. And actually, part of our construction, part of our installation. Our installation came together, I mean, part of the piece is actually installation, in the sense that we didn't know exactly how it would come together. We had the pieces and we had a broad vision in mind, but there's a lot of experimentation and stitching the fishing line to get the weights, to get the hanging just right.
Yes, definitely. So the rope, thank you so much for this is beautiful, thank you. Leanne, and the rope just staying there like this with the mesh, it was pure coincidence. And we didn't know it was going to stay there like that. We did, and we waited and it didn't fall. About agency, I think we had, at one point, I remember we were at the Holy Studio, And we started thinking that how we can define our roles and how we can define what we're doing inside, like within this project. And because sociologists, physicists, artists. And then we started giving ourselves names, radical reductionist, and I think I called myself the assembler or something. And I don't remember what we called Holly the visualizer. So we kind of like took on different roles with that collaboration. And I think that moment for me was the moment where we all let our expertises go. But it was kind of in suspension there, so it was kind of an arsenal, really, but it wasn't very much there. It is this, I don't know how to put it into words, really. I'm still trying to also think about the process, but I think that redefinition, and that gave us all different, that made us into a collaborative, creative contingency.
Maybe just one quick specific example. We were in Holly's studio. She brings out a huge sheet of written paper, but just
Newspaper something.
newsprint paper, and a box of charcoals. And we spent a good morning kind of following ideas. We start one place, and we all added to it and built it out. And I think that's a great example of all of us kind of let down our guard a bit and push.
We do have a few more questions, but I think maybe we have some coffee, tea, and cookies out there, so we can continue these conversations. And if you have questions after the second panel, maybe you can pose them. Thank you so much to our panelists.
So I'm very happy to introduce our next panel and moderators. And I'm going to start off with introducing the moderators, who will then introduce the panel. Elvira Hofschmidt is an independent artist and collaborator on the Low Core research team. She's also an author in the field of processes of artistic transformation, collaborative art, and temporary art spaces. She's currently working on her PhD in the Cultural Studies program at Queen's University, Kingston. And Dr. Margit Schild is an independent artist and collaborator on the Low Core research team. And she's a Berlin-based conceptual artist, curator, filmmaker, and author in the field of artistic transformation, collaborative art, and urban research. She holds a lectureship at the Berlin Center for Advanced Studies in Arts and Science at the University of the Arts. And so I'm very happy to let them take over now.
Thank you, Wendy. Welcome to this second panel this afternoon. I'm Elvira, this is Margit. And the title of the panel is Emergent Metaphor, the Visualization Process. Please welcome our panel members. We have Juna Krohn, Mimi German, and Ernesto Peña here, which I will introduce in a minute, a little bit more in detail. In this panel, we would like to talk about the role that visualization plays in art and science collaborations. The Low exhibit shows the results of a collaborative process, and the artworks may be seen as visualizations of this process, or as visualizations of the topic of emergence. Not so much as a science topic, but emergence, like we learned this morning or this before, a term that resonates in various fields, not only in physics. So we ask the question: is it possible to derive meaning from artworks that matter in all fields? And how do we read art? How do we actually read art on artworks? How is the process of reading informed through cultural constructs? This we shall discuss with our round of panelists and also hopefully have a conversation with all of us here in the room. We plan to start the conversation with posing questions to the panelists, and we can do 2 rather shorter rounds, and then we would like to open it up to the room. Altogether, we have around about 45 minutes to an hour to do that. Now, let me start by introducing the panelists properly. Juna Kroon. Is it Kroon? Kroon, okay. Kroon is a postdoctoral researcher in theoretical particle physics, in astroparticle physics, and cosmology at TRIUMPH, Canada's National Particle Acceleration Center in Vancouver, who's also a collaboration partner, obviously, of the Lunar project. Juna is also the lead scientist to the LISA consortium. And LISA, who knows what, is anyone in here who knows what that means?
You said Lisa or Liza?
I say Lisa. Yeah,
right?
Different people say Lisa.
It's probably Liza, but I say Lisa. There might be people in the room here who know what that means.
Yes.
I don't.
Yes, please. Would you mind telling us?
Oh, it's a planned space-based detector for gravitational waves.
Thank you.
Did you know the other describe it?
How do you say it?
Liza or
Space
Lisa?
array.
Is it Liza?
I think it's Lisa. I vote for Lisa.
All right. Laser interferometer space antenna. Okay, so you're the lead scientist there. And that's actually embedded in the TRIUMPH theory group. Let's give a welcome to Juna. Our next panelist is Ernesto Peña. He holds a PhD in language and literacy education from the University of British Columbia. He acquired international experience as a professional designer, a design educator, and he's currently an adjunct professor in educational technology at the University of British Columbia. Please welcome Ernesto Peña. And our third panelist is Mimi Gelman, an Anishinaabe Ashkenazi Métis visual artist, designer and educator. She holds a PhD in cultural studies from Queen's University, Kingston, and she's currently an associate professor in the Faculty of Culture and Community here at Emily Carr University. Welcome, Mimi Gelman. Thank you all for being here, and at this point I will pass on the word to Margit.
So, hello everybody. Juna, in preparation of this panel I looked up your website, and I found the word obsession. There it says, gravitational waves are my current obsession. So I have a first question, may I ask you, does it mean equations are open to obsession?
Equations are open to obsession. Yeah, I think, obsession, I think sort of in a, sort of a social context, like obsession often kind of like has some negative connotation, like you think of something unhealthy maybe, if like someone's obsessed by something. But I think obsession also is kind of it's also one of the things that leads to doing like interesting work. Like it's one of the characteristics of a successful scientist, perhaps artist as well, because it leads to just motivation, and you as a scientist and as an artist perhaps as well sometimes need to sort of stare at something, just wonder about something, investigate something in many different ways, endlessly, to find something new. So in that sense, gravitational waves are a very new thing in science, in the sense that we have predicted them and studied them for a long time, but since a few years only, we've been able to detect them directly.
So that means that that opens up a lot of opportunities for the future in terms of what we can learn about the universe using this new method of like measuring the universe. And that's very interesting to me. So it's an obsession because I just want to use this new tool that I have available to me to learn as much about the universe as possible.
Thank you. I mean, when I was reading the word, I was totally into it, right? Because I think many of us, we know what obsession means, to you really want to know something. And so I go on to the next question I have for you, because you are the member of the Team 9, the group which has also the title Hidden Sector, in phase 4 of the Leaning Out of Window project. So would you please briefly frame your full professional background and perspective, and how that influenced your engagement in the teamwork, which is the first question I have for you. And the second is, how did your professional view also impact your readings of the exhibition work?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it was very interesting to me, and also maybe just precisely my professional sort of practice, if you will, sort of to contrast that with like my sort of role in the team and the way these discussions developed. Because so in this team, like very often, I would sort of seed the conversation. That was not in a way that I planned really, or really could plan, because the conversations would just develop very quickly. Like I would sort of relate to a concept, and then one of the artists would pick up on that and have extra questions. And before I knew it, we were discussing something else altogether, which is very different from how my meetings in physics often take place. In which case, we often really sort of do not let go of a particular thing until we've like turned it around and everyone has the exact same understanding of something, because that is necessary for our progress. And in a physics context, often also, you start working on a particular project and you have an end goal in mind, and that's a very well-defined end goal. And it may happen, and it also very often happens during a project, that the goal changes. But that doesn't mean that at every stage in the process you have something in mind. So, and that's very important as well. Whereas like in our meetings, that was very much the opposite actually. We were kind of working, like the space of outcomes, if you will, was infinite. Whereas like very often in a physics context, you have one outcome in mind. So that was very interesting, and that also is interesting looking now at the outcome, because the outcome of my group in particular, of course, like at various stages in the process, you know, I knew what was going on, I knew what they were thinking about and what they were working on, and still this really surprises me, and I see a lot of elements of our conversation that they've processed, but not quite in the way that I expected. Yeah, and that was very interesting, because that's just very, very unusual for me compared to how I normally work.
And the second question I had, how did this, like, so you had a different experience in this context, how did this also impact your readings of the exhibition, if you had time to look at the artworks?
The exhibition, like, outside of my own group.
Exactly. Did you have a chance to look at them, look at the pieces?
Yeah, I had a chance to look at the pieces. Yeah, I think it's interesting, like especially so looking at like the exhibition, and also thinking about like what scientists people work with, because I think you see elements of like the type of science within Triumph people do, and then like what their group sort of, you know, how they sort of like interacted with that. I think that's very interesting. So David, for example, is also a theorist within Triumph, so you know, perhaps thinking in similar ways, and like how his group responded to that, and how my group responded to that is then, you know, it's quite different, but I think I can see elements of like the kind of the shared cognitive way that we think. Whereas other groups, for instance, work with an experimental scientist, and you know, sort of how that how their works responded to that. I see a difference, and that's kind of interesting for me too.
Thank you. I want to continue to. As a visual artist, you just completed your PhD in cultural studies. Congratulations again. And what was the title of your thesis again?
It's called Between the Dream Time and the GPS, the Metaphysics of Indigenous Mapping.
In your work, you combine approaches of artistic research, what is also called research creation, and scientific methodologies with indigenous knowledge. And you have also been a Leaning Out of Windows participant of a previous phase with an exhibition in 2018. So keeping in mind this transdisciplinary practice that you have, how did you relate to the works considering your own practice? Is there also a specific way how you engaged with your previous work with the science topic, and then also maybe relating it to what you see in the exhibition?
It's a very good question, thank you. My PhD looked at how land matters through the lens of indigenous artist maps, so not through disciplinary cartography. And I created a hybrid, I would call it a kind of emergent PhD, which combined traditional theory with indigenous methodologies. For example, dreaming and attending ceremony were part of my methodology. I also used design thinking. I designed and engineered a mobile traveling zone, an archive, indigenous archives of maps. I was also a curator, so there are 50 indigenous artist maps in the PhD, as well as working as an artist in my own practice. And I did my master's in the aesthetics of walking. And so I have a walking and mapping practice as an artist. And when I'm not sure if it's set up.
Yeah, so each panelist has a presentation, so we have those on here, so whenever you want to move to them, let us know.
So I will show you just a few, and it's hard to see with these lights, I'm sorry to say, because they're very, wondering if we could, they're very dark. Here we go, okay. And so I had an extraordinary experience with my physicist. He was the youngest of the group. He was still working on his PhD, and we had hours and hours of talking, and I really didn't feel very smart. I was trying to understand how he was, what piece he was biting off of with his work with antimatter. And finally, almost at the end of our last discussion, I said, you know, I'm really interested in scientists who are also believers. And he went, I'm a believer. I believe in Jesus Christ. I said, okay, let's talk. So then we had this dance where we were able to talk about our understandings of physics, his understanding of physics, my understanding of spirit and metaphysics. We started to talk about allegory. We started to talk about metaphor, which led to this series of drawings. And so in this one, as you can see, I'm kind of making a relationship between the chamber of the heart and the chamber of the accelerator. In this one, I'm talking about the Big Bang. So talking about matter and antimatter and the way they annihilate, and with this kind of image of, if you will, cosmic consciousness or some kind of Godhead. I have to tell you that the images spoke to me. And so they came out of me in a very intuitive way, which I think is the way that most artists work. We inculcate things. I think scientists also work like that. We let everything kind of filter down, and then perhaps some idea rises to the surface. In this case, I finished the drawings and then was able to see what the drawings were telling me, talking back to me. So I talk about this, and I will talk about this a little bit later, as thinking with the hand. And you can see, obviously, the scientist Dirac's equation. And the final of the images that I'm showing from the first iteration of the little exhibition, which I think is the best integration of the macro and the micro, the universe, the microscopic, Medewin, the Indigenous Ojibwe Medicine Society that I'm a member of, and alchemy. And so it became this place where all those things that are of my interest came together in this space.
So I have a question. Ernesto, would you please come back to the table?
No.
Ernesto, you're a designer. As a designer and design educator, you're well experienced in cross-disciplinary.
Go on. Is that a question?
That's what I learned about design. Designers are all-rounders, no?
Yeah, I would say
Wait.
that... Yeah, okay, so here comes the question.
Thinkers, creators and communicators. Sure. So they are skilled in crafting? No.
I think
Sometimes.
sure, yes. I would say so.
And they're used to work in teams to find solutions for design problems.
For sure. That will
Or maybe you have a chance to talk about your professional background in...
Yeah, it's tricky. I think the problem is that I'm a terrible designer.
A terrible designer?
Well, I will explain. So one of the reasons I ended up doing a PhD is because I realized that design at the granular level was not my thing. That I needed to take distance from the actual doing into the space of mostly thinking, I guess. And so most of the stuff that I write more recently is about systems, right? Design systems, meta design, stuff like that. So it's a tricky question, even if you didn't intend to, because I started as a design typographer, and then eventually I went like, this is not enough. I need to take distance, which is an interesting metaphor in itself. You know, just taking distance from the practice to be able to see what the whole implications of designing as a thinking method is. And that I do.
So let me then I have a question for you regarding the difference between art and design. What is the difference between a house made by a designer and a house made as an art work, made by an artist, for example, as a walk-in sculpture? The answer is the house made by a designer has to have a toilet. What it means is a designer not only has to meet regulation standards, but always has to bear human beings in mind.
Yes.
That's a huge difference to art. So with your expertise and your professional background, how do you read the artworks in the Leaning Out of Window exhibition?
Right. So I need to give a short disclosure. Like I was completely unaware of the exercise until very recently. So I'm actually joining these pretty much from the outset, right? And what I will start by saying is that I consider translation it is a political act to translate, like any other, like design is, right? Like actually, this comes back to your topic. It is translation means it comes with a political charge. So in order for me to be able to navigate the space and to come up with, ideas in general, I needed a framework.
right? Like I needed to think, how am I going to think about this before even seeing the works? So I decided to take kind of like really an old design approach to these kind of things, which comes from American pragmatism, semiotics specifically, from Charles Peirce. And as a fun, I guess, exercise, I decided to analyze the entire thing based on that particular approach, which I found interesting in itself because, you know, pragmatism has a very kind of scientific approach to philosophy, and I thought, well, this will be fun, or not. It will be fun for me, for sure. I made notes, so that probably is going to make it like not fun for you. So I will just try to go really quick over my notes and explain how I approach this exercise, if you don't mind. If I'm going over time, please just give me the, you know, the international silence. Okay, so well, one of the things that I have to say is that because I decided to use semiotics to read these things, and semiotic is basically the study of signs. And I am approaching the Peircean side of semiotics, which is Peirce defines the sign as this embodied, like it's not attached to a linguistic sign. It's just a sign. It can be whatever. It's just taking place it's in place of something else. Let's put it that way. It doesn't define what that is or the other thing that it's taking place of. So it's because I didn't know what I was going to encounter, that was kind of like this is going to help me. I knew that. Giorgio Maganese was around, so I was thinking like, oh, this is going to be insane, so I better be prepared. So the interesting thing about this sign, this Peircean sign, is that it is inherently multimodal. Like you don't necessarily have an idea of what it is. Like it can be whatever. It can be a sound, it can be an image, it can be a feeling, it can be many things. So the one interesting thing about this is that the idea of this sign is that you do not come to a place that has signs. You construct the signs on the spot. The sign is constructed in situ. So the sign has three elements. One is the object, which is, it's not object like as in a physical thing. It's the object of semiosis. It's the thing that will come into existence. It will be, it's the thing that we're trying to get meaning out of. Then we have the representamen, which is the thing that we will see to get meaning out of. And then we have the interpretant. And interpretant has been in my research like super important. And the interpretant is this idea that we all have this kind of repository of memories, experiences that actually build or make us able to construct the sign on the spot. And I do, now that I'm thinking about it, I can actually use that image that I mentioned that I wouldn't use, sorry about that. I do have an example. No, it's not that one. Not that one. That one, but the presentation, yes.
Was it a...
It was a huge diskette.
No, I know, oh yeah, it's, okay, I read it.
Yeah?
Got it.
Okay, so I'll just give you a super quick example. That is a huge diskette. So how many of you are unfamiliar with this object or how it works? What? Fantastic. This is going to make it way easier. So just to explain really quickly how this will work in semiotic terms. We know what this object is. We have seen one. And when we see a representation of this same object, like in the next slide, you know, like several different representations of this sign applied to the save button, for some of us, or all of us, who have the experience with the object itself, knowing the object itself is telling us what this thing does, right? So from that point of view, this thing is an icon, is a sign that represents a physical object, and we can derive meaning out of it because of the experience that we have, because that experience is part of our interpretant. Now, there is one there, which one is that one. It says guardar, save icon. You know how the kind of like slanted thing is a little bit slanted? I can tell that that designer doesn't know what actually looks like in real life. The second one, the second column, second row. Because for that individual, probably that thing is a symbol. That means that person had to learn about this thing without knowing the object itself. Now, every time I encounter one of these pieces in general, I did the exercise of thinking about how I was constructing this design on the spot. So, for example, in the case of Tio's work, there's a lot of stuff that I am familiar with because I'm Mexican. So there were a lot of common interpretants. I will say like, oh, this looks a little bit like a map in my own country. This particular sign brings some things of my interpretant out. So at the end, by approaching this exhibition in that particular way, again, without having much context, it ended up being like a party of signs. Like I was able to identify, oh, these are icons, or at least in my mind, my interpretation of them, these are icons, these are symbols, these are indexes. For example, there's the entire part of the exhibition that deals with neutrinos. And I remember, is that yours? The neutrinos one? No, I can't remember. But there was... Oh, well, for example, that one. Like the idea, as you explained yesterday, like we don't necessarily see them, but we know the effect they have. So those are indices. Those are a very particular kind of sign that it's a sign of cause and effect. Like that's how you read those. So at the end, what I ended up, doing was just trying to get that particular politics of semiotics into my own kind of interpretation of the words, which gave me a very comfortable way of doing it because I'm not a physicist, I'm not an artist. So yeah, I just tried to distance myself from the entire thing. That was a long question, I'm sorry. I mean, a long answer.
Thank you, Nestor. We will come back to that.
Oh,
So, Juna,
Yeah.
as someone who is embedded in the scientific community, as a researcher who has to follow scientific standards, and specific scientific methodologies, what significance does visualization of information have in your field? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I would say an underrated one, like in the sense that it's used a lot, definitely. I don't think it's thought about enough. Like I think it could, we could make a more optimal use of visualization as a community if we rethink it. But it's used most often. It's used to represent information that we could represent in a different way, right? Like, for example, you have an experiment. It takes a lot of data. You could write down tables and tables of this data, and that exists somewhere too. That's sometimes publicly available, sometimes it isn't. But what will happen in a paper is like a more compact form of this data, and that's in a visualization. So like a plot, for example, you could represent all the data that you've taken in a plot. And that also allows you to see relations between things. Sometimes relations that you expected, so that you were testing, for example, and sometimes relations that you didn't know about. And when that's the case, then visualization might also give you an intuition, which then later might lead to further understanding. So intuition in science often is kind of a precursor for a new theory, something that we could understand and like break down in one line, as David was saying. A new theory often starts with intuition, and intuition often comes from visualization. And when I'm thinking about questions that I want to answer, scientific questions, and relations between different concepts, I might, or when I'm learning about something new, when I'm reading a paper, what I very often do is plot things myself. So just to understand better, I visualize things. So I can have an understanding on the level of an equation, but even if I'm understanding an equation, I'm plotting a relation in my head, if you will. And sometimes it's a harder equation than I pull up on my computer, or or on the blackboard with so visualization aids understanding, and also might be a precursor to understanding, because the data will tell us something that we didn't know before, and that will lead to us developing a rationale for a particular relation.
May I directly lead to Mimi with, you're also talking about technology of intuition, right?
Yes.
Can you talk about this?
In my thesis, I talked about technologies of intuition as being a methodology, that I was going to think about what those sort of intuitive properties were, how it was that certain notions or ideas would rise unbidden, and again, that speaks to this idea of an emergent kind of practice as a methodology. But I think that one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of the work here, and kind of intriguing similarities between the works, kind of resonances, parallels between art and science. I went back to this question of intuition and the relationship between, in my world, in the Ojibwe Anishinaabe world, between aesthetics and storytelling. And that storytelling is a very, very sort of important part of this. But more than that, another notion comes to mind in terms of intuitive properties, and that's thinking about the non-binary. Like, how do we consider questions of value and beauty? How do we think about differences between art and science in a different way, in a non-binary way, which leads me to the question of language, because language predisposes us to think in certain ways. So what happens if you come from a culture that, whose language suggests that there's no separation between you and the other and all of the other constituent bodies in the world. And I'm just going to show a few works. They're not from this exhibition. It's from an exhibition called Stories and Structures and Connections. And when I was thinking about this exhibition here, I was thinking about the other exhibition and the way that, in this case, Aborigine artists from Australia are in fact representing, if you will, I'm not even sure if that's the best word, their understandings of their relationship with the natural world. And so on the left of each of these slide frames, you have a microscopic image, a scientific image, in this case moss sperm taken by Greg Ross, and then you have Witchetty Grub by Jennifer Napalgadi Lewis. And you can start to see that, that there are tremendous similarities in between this kind of slice, this microscopic slice of moss sperm, which relates to the Witchetty Grub. In this case, you've got a microscopic image of white ochre, and then Gordon Rainey is actually doing a painting of white ochre. These artists did not refer to microscopic images when they made their work. These are resonances. In this case, we're looking at collagen fibrils by Ed Simpson, and then skin, and that's the skin of alligators. Alligator skin by a drawing by Joshua Monson. In this case, we've got a micrograph of ribosomes, and then this particular work, which is called Water Dreaming, which in fact refers to a kind of the cellular structure of both plants and water. And then I think this is the last one that I have, optic nerve, and then a painting by Lukata Jukupa, fringe rush seed dreaming. And so I think that this is really, it fascinates me that tribal cultures who don't identify a separation between themselves and the natural world seem to be able to allow a certain kind of understanding of that world to appear naturally in their work. And then I think this is the last one, blood clotting cell from an estuarine crocodile, and by Yami in Guria, which is a story, a folk story about a woman who is taken over by an alligator, and that's the word for alligator, Guria. So I'm fascinated by this, and it's something that I saw in the works here, these kinds of resonances between languages that we assume to be so radically different, this language of art and the language of science, and in fact, I think they're just perhaps being looked at from different perspectives.
I wanna, before to Nestor again, I wanna first ask Juna another follow-up question. Do you think that the different disciplines may actually cross-fertilize? It seems like they do in an intuitive way here, without even knowing, maybe. And do you think that creative disciplines may inspire physicists in a way that could change scientific output?
Yeah, so I have actually some slides really show them. So I think when you think of like cross-fertilization between artists and physicists, it's like it's quite easy to find examples of artists being inspired by nature and by physics. And it's a bit harder to find examples of the other way around. And I think this also a little bit because scientists are a little bit stubborn, maybe. And I think that is a shame because I think it could, and it has also in some aspect, like in some sort of historical events, led to very, very useful tools for us. And I think it's worth rethinking some of our sort of ways that we're stuck in, and it's often also to do with visualization. So in this slide, I show, for example, a result from quite a recent work of mine. And what this shows is that like we often think about something like we want to represent a lot of different information in a plot. But a plot is like really just a 2D surface, right? So here, for example, I have like this 2D surface, like so two axes that are labeled. And then I'm also representing some other sort of dimension with these lines. And then I'm plotting things and I'm using different symbols for different dimensions of information. And I'm using different colors to represent yet another thing. This is the temperature, which is then labeled on the in the legends. So there's like, here's all of this information, all of these different all of these different sort of elements of information that each point in the plot should represent. But I really had to think so hard of like, how can I capture all of this different information in this 2D plane? And it's actually very limiting. And it's kind of surprising to me that we are still using this 2D plane, because I think if you think about scientific information and how it was passed on 50 years ago, say, it's just in journals, right? So the scientists would get a journal in the mail, and these would have papers in it, and these would have like plots in it. So it makes sense that in that case you use a plot, a 2D surface. But now how I read scientific papers is just on my laptop, and my laptop also can represent 3D in videos. It has sounds and stuff, but still we're using these 2D surfaces. So and I think thinking about this was also very interesting to me with my group, because one of the artists in my group, Leo, and then his last name I really hard to pronounce, but it's Stevens. Yeah, it is Stevens. Yeah. So Icelandic name, not pronounced how you would think if you read it. But so he worked a lot with visualizing or using soundscapes to represent information. So you could, any type of information that you could put on a plot, for example, or you could represent with the dimension, you could also capture in sound using like a Fourier transform. There's a way of processing the information that you could use sounds. And it seems very interesting to me to explore whether you know, the same intuition that I can get from a plot, the same type of understanding of relations that I can get from a plot, whether we could use, in the future, we could use sound to do something like that. And for now, if you ask physicists, and also if you ask me, that seems very, very difficult. But that might also be because we've had so many years to get used to representing information in this way, and perhaps if you would, from a young age, train to also understand information in different ways, and understand scientific concepts in different ways, that could be something that would just open up like a new sort of tool for us to use, to understand relations, and also to get intuition that perhaps we wouldn't get, if representing information in another way. So the next slide I have another example. So it seems, I've been talking about spaces quite a bit. So space, of course, in our language means like maybe a position, like I'm standing here in this room, you have coordinates on Earth where I am, yesterday I was somewhere else completely, you use different coordinates for that. But for us, as physicists and as scientists, we've learned to think about space more generally than that. Like, so we also have like the concept of internal spaces. So anything that you could put a number on, like that has a particular dimension, we also think about it as a space. So for example, here is a plot from a recent paper on the left, a recent paper of mine, where there is a bubble, and that bubble is actually existing in space and expanding in space. So I'm thinking about actual space. But there's also, even within this plot, sort of elements of different internal spaces that have a meaning in real space. And on the right is from that same paper. These are related to these internal space elements. This is field space. So you could be at a particular location in field space, and that just means that these fields have a particular numerical value associated to them. They have a coordinate associated to them, just like you could be in real space. So I think this type of, this type of way of thinking about dimensions, and not just space-time dimensions, but dimensions that just relate to different elements of what we want to describe, that will also open up sort of a new avenue of exploring how to represent information and visualize information. So I think in some ways, physicists and scientists are used to sort of broaden our horizon and think of things more sort of, let go of sort of different concepts. And this is an example. But in some ways, we're still stuck to this like very rigid way of representing information. And from, in that sense, we could learn from artists. And I have some more examples of like how that maybe happened in the past. But okay, so if you go to the next slide. So I think, okay. So extra dimensions. Also relating to space a little bit, but internal space potentially. So what I try to do, I come up with theories of nature that explain all the phenomena that we see well. So we want to explain, we're reductionists, we always ask why. So we have all these particles, fundamental building blocks of nature, and they have properties. And we're not just happy with these properties. Like we don't just want to have like some sort of like manual, like some sort of we have these sort of books that tell us like, okay, this building block has this particular mass and relates to other particles like this, but we're not happy with that. We want to know why. So we want to explain all these fundamental properties. And one way that physicists in different theories have learned to explain these things is using extra dimensions. So if you go to the next slide, so here it just looks like I have all these different particles, if you will, and they have different sizes. But if you go to the next slide, you could, for example, in this sense, explain it just by adding a different dimension. And here now the different sizes just correspond to different locations in the different dimensions. So extra dimensions are a very important concept in physics. But then it also becomes like very important to think of ways to visualize that, because that is, of course, very, very hard to sort of visualize. We think in 3D, and this is something that this is something that historically there's been a bit of personalization. Let me, like in the next slide, just maybe an example. So there's different methods that exist, and they resonate like with how that happens in art and also in literature. So there's this slicing method, for example, and that really, the first sort of historical example of this appearing is not in the scientific context, but it's in this novella, which is like a book written by a high school teacher called Abbott's. And in this book you have like it's about a 2D world where figures live. And they just go on with their life, and at some point they have this sort of weird phenomenon of like some sort of circle passing through, like some circle sort of getting smaller and larger, and what you then see is these 2D figures that live in this plane leave their plane and actually see that what they're seeing in their plane is an extra dimension, so like this sphere passing through their plane, and so they're observing an extra dimension, just through an intersection of something that's passing through. And so that's a particular way that an extra dimension extra to our world, you could potentially observe too. So it's the slicing method. It's a way of visualizing an extra dimension, and perhaps also a way that an extra dimension or consequences of an extra dimension would show up. And then a completely different method is the projection method, and that's very similar to perspective drawing. So here, this is an example of like representing 3D in a 2D plane, but in a very similar, you could generalize this concept like this type of thing mathematically, and you could represent 4D in a 3D plane, for example. And I have examples of that on the next slide. So this is a hypercube. This is a cube like you could have in 3D, but then in 4D, and how you could represent that using these two different methods. Now, this is on a 2D surface, actually. So these are things that, these are ways to represent an extra dimension, which is a very important concept in physics, that we have learned also to do like from literature and from art. And I think in a similar way, if there were more communication, like if there was more, I don't have a particular example right now, but I think there's many different concepts that are important in physics, it's very hard to wrap your mind around. And because they're hard to wrap your mind around, they're also hard to get intuition and feel, creativity and intuition plays a very important part in doing my work. More further communication could perhaps help us, grow further and get more intuition and get more more sort of creative ideas that will help us understand what we're observing better.
I just had this glimpse of what if we would walk through the exhibition as a projection that doesn't live in 2D or in 3D, but actually in real space, and we're not projecting it, but we're actually experiencing it, and in order to understand this. It's just thank you. I would like to ask Ernesto now. In your doctoral research, you explore the mobilization and evolution of what is called visual literacy across disciplines, from, like you said, from its earliest occurrence in literature. Can you briefly explain what visual literacy is? And given your research interests, how do we derive meaning from a visual?
I started with the same question, what visual literacy is, and the reason that research started is because I arrived to my doctoral program assuming that the first occurrence in literature was in the 70s, coming from design, Donnie's. And then my supervisor responded like, oh, of course, you mean Miss Harris, I did something. I went, no, who's that? And then she didn't know who I was talking about, I didn't know who she was talking about, so I assumed that there will be earlier occurrences of the term. And the earliest occurrence in 39 is in the context of actually museums. Like the first idea of some technology bringing visual literacy into the masses was through museums. And so now the problem with visual literacy, or with visual as a literacy, is that the idea of literacy changed completely between the mid-80s and the mid-90s. It used to be purely linguistic, and then in the context of literacy education became semiotic. So, which is great, because then you don't need to know how to read and write to be literate in something. Your own personal knowledge makes you literate, which is great, but then you can be literate and illiterate at the same time if you don't know how to read or write, but you do have a literacy. So at the end of my dissertation, I end up hating the term, by the way, but at the end of the dissertation, I realized that the problem was that these two concepts, like the teachable and the unteachable, were like mushed together. And it was necessary to separate between what is actually a visual genre and what is visual literacy. And visual literacy will be something that is inherent in all of us, and a visual genre will be something very specific to a very specific field or realm of knowledge. Now, for that project, what I ended up doing, and I want to show this because it's sort of a weird response to your question. Your question wasn't weird, the response is weird.
This?
Yes. So, now, because I was facing a similar problem that you're talking about. Like I wanted to represent networks over time, and it was really hard with the available visualization tools that I had in place. So I started trying to find a way to represent how a particular bit of knowledge, or knowledge token, I called, jumped between over time, and how it was taken by people in different disciplines, and so I started plotting 3D. Like that was the most logical way of doing it. So you will be able to see the stuff from the bottom and then see it from one side, and then being able to navigate. It ended up being a mess, but it's a navigable mess. So at the end, what ended up happening is that this is a plot of my lead review. So you click on one of those and it connects to all of the other words, and you can navigate from, which one is Y? Y? X? Y? No, X. Which one? X? X1? X1?
I mean, you can call them whatever you want, but normally we do X and Y.
Y, then Y. On the Y-axis, all the way to the top will be the most recent works, and all the way to the bottom will be the most, the database. So that, of course, I couldn't present as a dissertation, so I had to write the entire thing and then present this as a supplement, which, you know, it speaks to your problem. So now, the interesting thing about this is that this idea of how we build meaning out of it, it goes back to the interpreters, to the commonalities that we have. And the previous panel discussed a little bit about this, how we, the way in which we can actually derive meaning is from finding those commonalities in the way we build science. But the way we can actually, you know, like elaborate on that or create a rhetorical discourse is from deriving from those. And that's exactly what rhetoric is. You know, like metaphors, analogies, it's just parting from a common understanding that we have and then finding another different routes to actually make that meaning more fixed, I guess, more stable. That's it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Before we open it up to the audience, maybe you would like to respond, right?
I just wanted to respond to that, and I have to go to a slide. And so this is the work of Nigel Bomi, who was an Australian Aborigine born circa 1895 in the region known as Cutler. He's identified by his moiety, and let's see, okay, Nigel Bomi, Nargawiti. So what's interesting about his works is that he does them across time in the same place using natural geologic formations, chroma lines, fissures, and foundational patterns and structures. So each layer unfolds, includes the next, which each subsequent layer adding to and perfecting the whole. So what's interesting also about it is that it is believed that, and it's interesting that the spirits of the next one, which are Mimi spirits, I don't know why they're called Mimi spirits, but they are. I thought that was really cool when I came across that. Are credited with making the first rock paintings and teaching Aborigines how to paint. And so the late physicist David Peat wrote a lot about indigenous symbols, and he says they transcend the sign. And he says, as living embodiments of the teachings. So this is what he says, quote, within indigenous science, a particular symbol is not an abstraction or a reflection of reality that a model within Western science is. Rather, it is something that permits direct connection with the energies, spirits, and animating power of nature. There is the sense that, like a holograph, a symbol, an object can enfold the whole of reality. So I think that's kind of interesting. It builds on what both of you were saying from a different perspective and a different culture.
I would like to actually open it up now to you all as well. So if there are comments, questions.
We can turn the light up.
Can I see the hands again? There were like hands and
That's pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was incredibly stimulating. I have 3 questions, very brief. Maybe on, like, starting from the last point, it's the last thing that you said. So, is science in indigenous thinking something alive, something living, something that has extensions? This is how I want to see. So, I was just going to ask you that. To Juno, thank you so much. First of all, it's fascinating to hear about how you think that actually sound might trigger some kind of an inspiration. Because one of the things that I remember about the gravitational waves when they were announced, the thing that stuck to my mind was that it was a chirp, right? So it wasn't visual, but it was a sound that came with the gravitational waves. So I was thinking that maybe hearing might be the next medium that actually science and theoretical physics can explore. And the question I have is kind of like very personal in the sense that what is it that you saw between your work or your group in relation to the exhibition and ours? Because both you and David are theoretical physicists, and so I was curious about what are the commonalities between those. And to Ernesto, very briefly, Party of Science. What are the connections in the Party of Science, and how do you? And in the last slide that you show, the representations, how to build a meaning, also is about connections, and it's also about extensions. So, can you say more about that?
I'll
we go in order?
Sure, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Anishinaabe Mawin is a language of animacy. And so when we talk about a tree, for example, an elm tree, we would say that tree, we would say tinka tinka, which means that tree, when the wind is blowing and it makes a shoo-shoo sound. So the tree is not separate from the wind. So it's always connected to the context within it finds itself. Or, for example, the word for mushroom, pupowi, that being that pushes itself up through the earth in the night. It also means an erection, by the way, in my language. We have wonderful, wonderful playful language. But so it's always within the context of the field within which it finds itself. We have things that are animate. Someone asked me once, so are stones animate? And I could say, yes, sometimes. And what I mean by that is the context within which those stones find themselves, that sometimes the conditions are that they have animacy and other times that they don't. And so the language predisposes us to think of everything within the field of connections.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I do realize that I'm really taking my own perspective into this, and I wonder if it's going to be very easy for me to explain what I see as a commonality, but I'll try. I think so. You worked a lot with like strings and like yeah, strings. Are interesting things in physics, and it has to do with waves as well. And it has to do with like a particular resonances, and perhaps this is also maybe my association from hearing David talk about the construction of your work. But yeah, that just relates. I think that that just relates to a lot to how I think about physics. I think this is really connected to ways that we think about on a daily basis. Think about theories and our work. And yeah, I'm not sure, of course, now having heard David talk about, having heard you both talk about like the construction of it, if I can really separate these things, if I would have just like with a completely blank mind, not having been part of this project, if I would have seen that in work, I don't know that, but I do now. And I think, so that makes me, I can see the theoretical physics in the work now. I don't know if I can see like really particular similarities with what my group did, but I can definitely see similarities with things that we've talked about as a group. Yeah, and that's just a lot to do with waves and resonance, and so resonance has a well-defined meaning in physics as well, and has a meaning in I've used it I've used it in the sort of the social meaning before, and now I'm using it in the physics meaning. But I see that in your work, and we've discussed this as a group too. So that's more what I meant. You want this?
Hello. So you asked first about the Web of Science, right?
I asked about the party of science.
Oh.
What is the poison that gets that party going? So,
Can you repeat the question again?
the party of science.
Oh,
semiotics.
Oh, right, yeah. The party, right. Sorry. You won't believe this, but I actually, when you speak, your pronunciation gets differently in my own kind of like ears, because I have an accent, and that's a problem. You also listen with an accent. So I would say that, it's a nice party. I get to see how there's this concept in semiotics called infinite semiosis. Like you assign triggers another one, triggers another one, triggers another one. So there are specific works that are easy to follow. There are others like the one that has the one this way that has it's a visual representation of ocean waves. Like that one, for example, it takes harder to grasp, because I need to think in terms of transmediation, like how this makes sense to me visually, right? Now, the other question that has to do with the connections, there is this concept called citation ontologies, and the idea is that every time you connect to a different work, ideally you should be able to represent what that connection is, whether it is citing, refuting, mentioning. So what I failed in doing in that particular work is in representing those citations ontologies in a way that was clear enough. So I was just making the point that there was a connection. That could be someone rejecting someone else's pieces. And another point that I tried to make in that work is that there is such a thing as a non-connection. So for example, which is again a political move, if you cite someone that was cited by someone else, but you don't cite the original source, that is a political move, and there's a lot of that in my dissertation. So I think that's the only one that I really, truly failed in representing, because it's a non-connection. Yeah, it's this one. Yeah, I was like, I couldn't hear any difference between. Yeah.
So sort of just riffing off of what Mimi was talking about, referring to strings of connections, I was wondering what connective strings you've seen between step 1 from Roe and emergence. And of course, I left also open that question to other philosophy.
Well, I think that it's been said already that the work that came out of the first iteration was rather different in that I think that for the most part, if not for the whole part, the artist made the work. And so I think that that perhaps there was, I don't know how to articulate it, a dimensional difference, something that I'm seeing here. The first iteration was beautiful, it was exciting, but I find this even more exciting, more layered, offers more possibilities for thinking differently than the original one. And I think that potentially was the artist getting into the physicist, forgive me, getting into the mix. And so I think that was the other kind of factor that although they were in the mix originally in terms of dialogue, what happened here seemed to be emergent, something different, something new that I didn't see in the first iteration.
Any other questions?
Harriet?
Just to follow up on that idea of the difference in the titles of both of them, and the idea of antimatter being, and this may be really simplistic, but the idea that there was something slightly negative in the drawing about it, as opposed to the idea of emergence being a kind of opening and maybe a looser idea.
Metaphorically, one can think about it in terms of language and what it spurs, what it spawns in you. And so perhaps that, particularly for those non-scientists of us to think about antimatter as compared to emergence, there seems to be, perhaps in the language suggests a different possibility.
Well, it's more permissive in that certain way. So it's a small point in a way, but it could make all the difference in terms of the ensuing conversations. Because I found within our group the idea of emergence was really allowed us all kinds of conversations, which were kind of free-flowing and exciting, and all of us always learning something from each other. I was recognizing the depth of Patrick, our physicist's knowledge of his area, and then, but also respecting our own knowledges and loving the places where they overlapped and where they could feed each other new structures for expression. So.
I think it's interesting because with antimatter, it was a very specific scientific concept, which we gave to the artists and the physicists. And I think there were something like 4 or 5 different aspects of antimatter that the artists took up in various ways. And so when we went to the second phase with emergence, and the idea was a kind of leveling out, as Jess offered, so that everybody was sort of on an equal playing field, there were moments when Ingrid and I were thinking, oh no, was this the right move? Should we have like pushed for something more specific? And I think there was conversations of something more specific. But it's interesting to be at this end of things now, and to recognize that this opening out, or this permissiveness that emergence allows for, produce things that we really could not have anticipated. And also, in some ways, just trusting the process, because the theme of emergence was emergent based on the first phase. I don't know if it would have come about. I think it was in response to that first phase, to the specificity of antimatter, perhaps the language produced something, but also I think it is part of the larger process. So I just wanted to say, like, in terms of being in the middle of it, there were moments where we were like, oh no, was this the right move? Was this the right gesture? But hearing your conversations and seeing the work, it feels like that permissiveness allowed for the artists to feel comfortable, because as artists, if we don't understand the concept without the math, it's kind of hard to know what our move is. But the fact that everybody was sort of a little uncomfortable opened up something that I don't know if it would have been possible otherwise.
Randy, in the spirit of comparing these two phases and in the spirit of design that we're talking about, do you think we can, you can pull up the slide where you see the logo for linear formation for the first phase and the second phase? And I have my question, I think it's more directed to Vanessa. I'm really curious, from a designer's perspective, your thoughts. How do these two different logos strike you?
That's a difficult question. I have been trained to try to provide as little aesthetic, assessment as I can on these kind of things. So what I would say is that the only reason I can read this one better is because I'm more used to this alignment. That one requires me to try to, yes, it makes an effort to read. I think you want an aesthetic assessment, but that's not going to happen.
What do you mean by aesthetic assessment?
Yeah, I wouldn't say like, oh, this is better or something like that.
No, not at all. A visual analysis.
I would say that...
What did they tell you about the design? You know how you were saying the floppy disk, you can tell this one has never seen a real floppy disk. If you were to read these as works,
right,
what do they tell you about?
I would say that probably that one wasn't necessarily done by a designer in the most kind of conventional sense of design. Probably because that's a little bit more ludic, I will say that is probably more a work of an artist than a designer. But I might be very wrong.
Totally designer.
Then I'm very wrong.
But a designer interested in emergence, right? I think that's interesting in terms of us working with designers. We should. Well, no, what you were just saying in terms of the first, they're both designers, they're both masters of design students at Emily Carr. But working with them, they were trying to understand the ideas of each phase.
Right.
And they're being responsive to the conversations that we have with them. And they're two very different kinds of designers as well.
I think it's interesting that it has step one in there.
Yeah.
It kind of also looks a bit like you still have all these elements, Now you're kind of condensing, like something else is emergent. I think that's interesting.
Any other questions, comments?
So while we're on the topic of these diagrams, and Nestle, you mentioned how ludic they are, I'm wondering if it's one of the critical roles of a project like this to expose the situated knowledges involved in diagrams, infographics, and so maybe for Ernesto and Juna, after seeing so much visual information, you can see obviously that it's hand-drawn or seemingly, and I'm wondering how much a project like this allows for the differential qualities of situated knowledge to come through, as opposed to kind of universalizing infographics.
can you define further situated knowledge? Like what do you mean by situated knowledge?
Sorry, this is maybe too abstract. I'm drawing from Donna Haraway and her concept of situated knowledges as opposed to what she calls the collectric. So having a map, for instance, that doesn't have an attribution, they use a kind of Apollonean view from above, and doesn't really acknowledge the creator of a map, right? So what I find striking in a diagram like this is how it is personalized, that you get a sense of ludic quality, that there's something artistic in a very broad sense, but in an infographic like we saw presented maybe more by Juna and your network diagram, there's more of a sense of it being authoritative, exposing a kind of mastery, and I appreciate the kind of the way in which a diagram like this can be revisable, or it doesn't assume mastery in the same sense, just by virtue of its aesthetic qualities.
Right.
I don't mean to ramble. I'm just thinking that it's an important critical role of a project like this to kind of to expose the all vision is embodied, to kind of riff off Haraway again, and so I'm wondering if this resonates with your practice, the situated knowledge that comes through, and then the power dynamics, how certain infographics are used for exposing mastery.
I have to say, full disclosure, I love Ingrid's work in general, precisely because I'm a designer and because my background is in information design. I don't think that information design has to be sanitized at all. I think that whatever brings the information out, whatever makes you aware, whatever brings meaning, that is a powerful, piece of visualization. Unfortunately, I'm also a typographer, and that's what that thing kind of this particular assessment probably that's why it feels like, oh my God, you're so strict. So I think those are very, very fine, perfect visualizations of the entire process. Now that I have went through the process, particularly with this one, I can see everything. And that's exactly what a visualization should be about. So thank you for your question.
I think also it was less authoritative, because we've seen this diagram at several points, and obviously a lot of thought went behind how this project is, sort of designed and what people meant to do, but it was never you were told, okay, you are now here, at this step you should do so and so, Of course there were different sort of benchmarks, but it was, it was not as as imposed on the groups from above, this is what you're meant to do at this stage. So in a sense, maybe that, that is in here as well. I wonder, am I in this diagram? Sorry, am I in here?
Well, I'm a bit confused because some points we're talking about the signage, the titles, and sometimes we're talking about the diagrams.
Yeah.
So I get confused which ones you're talking about.
I thought this was about the diagrams, but I could have just answered the complete.
Because there was talk about the Luddite designer or the topography and so on. So they're all different aspects. But anyway, the diagram itself, yes, you are pictured. So what team are you?
I think I heard 9. I also didn't know that before, but
I can't remember now what number. But there are 11 clusters there, and so you are one of those clusters. So you are depicted there like a star in the constellation.
I think we. Oh, sorry, Ingrid.
Yeah. Well, I just wondered if there were any, because I knew you had some presentations and there were some other images, and I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to, if there were any other elements, if you wanted to show any of them, if there was anything else.
You know what? Yes, I have one website, and this is just I just wanted to show to the general audience how other projects have tried to use tools like metaphors to tackle difficult questions about information. It's there it is. That's one. So that is a that is called Imaginaries Lab. It's currently being worked with in Carr and the idea is to bring a concept that can serve as a metaphor for other things. And this is built based on the assumption that for us to be able to, to have the similar understandings, we need topoi, we need a common place of starting. And after that, we can go into the metaphors. So I highly recommend you to take a look at that. It's very strict in terms of classic rhetoric. Like it follows all the kind of like you have to find a syllogism and then you have to compare, and it's like in cards. So I don't know, I thought it will be interesting. It's I definitely can't read the URL from here. I won't even try. No.
Imaginary.es
/ new metaphor. Okay. Oh, there you go. So it's it's
Is this randomly generated?
Yes. Yes. But the idea is that it has a full kind of like if you go down, it explains the entire thing and how it was conceptualized and yeah, it has cards and yeah, it has nothing to do with me, but it's a fantastic project. I thought it would.
Well, I'm just thinking if we move the questions into the group, like have a short break and then move into the larger group. But I do have some questions that I can say for after.
Do you have questions on the visualization?
Well, one was about the difference, and this is for anyone, is that difference between metaphor and analogy that comes up. So in some cases in the works, we see clearly this is an analogy for a process. And sometimes it is much more the metaphor place. And so we're seeing a kind of a fluidity back and forth. And I know Ernesto, you've been working in that area, but any of you could, if you wanted to address those differences.
Well, usually it's tricky because it depends on who's dealing with the definition, but usually will be like an analogy is more of an explicit comparison between those two things, and a metaphor will be an implicit one. There's a there's a poem by a Latin American author, and this is how I tend to explain these things. Like it's not as saying your teeth are like pearls. That will be kind of a comparison, an explicit comparison, as saying the pearls in your mouth. Like that will be a metaphor. So, but again, it depends, I think, a lot on who is defining these. My definition of metaphor is very, very, very classical, classic rhetoric. I'm sure there are other kind of like more open definitions.
I think you said that metaphors transport meaning. Yeah, because thinking about it that way, there's like a lot of analogies in physics, a lot. Like they're very, very useful, and actually no metaphors that I can think of that we use. So that's interesting to me as well. Like it's just not a concept I work with very often.
I think we're out of time, but in a very interesting way. So, in preparation of this panel, Mimi came up with a wonderful idea for a final statement. And it's a bit like, your idea is a bit like credits, like the credits for a movie. So would you...
Sure, and this came from an improv conference that Marky organized in Berlin a couple of years ago now? 2017. And I don't have A.J. Hebel here with the piano because he was playing with me, but we sort of did a kind of a beat poet thing. But what I did is I went through all the artist statements and I pulled out this beautiful, beautiful language, because language is really important to me. And so I'm just gonna go. So, emergence as metaphor, that unsettling space, hybridized thinking, pushing a spatial sense between pattern and chaos and structure, collapse, generative, interdisciplinary emergence, disassembling and reassembling the multiple perspectives that become a third thing. The vast borderland of dangerous certainties, associative thinking, and specialized knowledge, they bring us different sensibilities, borrowed and bent, an extended social experiment, a productive rhythm. We flesh out ideas and simulations, evocative imagery, aesthetic integration, natural form and entropy, cutting together, apart, imagination as boundary making, a critique of classification. The crowded particles and limiting infinities, the scopic capabilities, and mysterious dark energy become medieval quintessence, magnetic fluid, topographical wireframes, fully concretized. These they symbolize emergence and unique directions. They have tacit understandings, foundational questions, and we come to neutrino oscillation. Through careful listening, we arrive at multiplicity, elementary constituents, mind melding like a single entity, willfully not knowing, knowing, not knowing, unknowing, autocatalytic sets, vulnerabilities, fluid field of inquiry, our collective unconscious, and the complex phenomena of magic drawing creates radical imagination, shamanic ceremonies, and Fibonacci growth patterns. We have iterative processes, expanding the possibilities of frequencies in our visual field of fantastic speculation. They are luminous and unobserved. There are moments in unseen space, ever-changing, envisioning processes. The anti-music reverses logic gates to find the sweet spot.
We were thinking maybe we'd take a break, but we thought maybe while we're here, maybe if there's still some questions or some comments. I know there's some questions from the first panel that didn't get asked. So this is an opportunity for us to sort of see anything else that's surfaced at what we talked about so far.
And also anyone who was involved in this process to share the different approaches that your groups took in taking up scientific ideas, how those how you took up the scientific ideas, how these generated subtopics for your team. So this is something, you've never, as a group, come back together again since October 2018. So this is a chance also to share a little bit about how your team struggled to come up with the subtopic and so on. So this is a chance to just kind of, huddle together in however you want to do that and share some of that. And if there's any other questions for anyone here, panelists and so on.
Can everybody else just listen to your panel, like to your little group?
Well, we're not separating out into, we're doing like everyone, right?
Okay.
But if anyone wants to sort of volunteer, how you struggled with coming up with subtopics, like it was interesting for us to be polling, please send us, what is your topic? And we get something from someone, and then a few weeks later they write back and say, no, now it's this. And there was this constant evolution and changing mind, and now take out this word, and like an octopus. No, thinking like an octopus. No, like an octopus. And so, it was fascinating to see how this all emerged.
I just wanted to, just based on the last panel, I was hearing some things that really struck me, and I haven't quite figured out where my head's at with it, but I was thinking about the idea of visualization, the visualization process, and the conversation around, I think, Judy, you brought up intuition, and you talked about the interpretant. I think Mimi also talked about intuition as well, and the notion of extra dimensions. So I feel like there's something here in the visualization process, both on the part of those making images, whether artists or scientists, and those of us who are receiving those images, that we're sort of operating within this extra dimension. And part of that extra dimension is what we bring, I think the term, the situated knowledge, or, you know, what we bring of our own experiences to the making of images and what we bring to the reading of those images. And the word extra dimension, which I know means something very specific in physics, which I don't know or understand, but I feel like it's a really interesting term to think about, that there's something happening here that we're struggling in some ways to find a language for. And we use the word intuition because we kind of know what that is. But there's something between art and science, that there's a kind of spaciousness or a spatiality that Sanem was sort of sharing with us that describes this kind of extra dimension as a kind of expanding notion of space, and also something that's emergent or something that we don't quite have the language for. And some of what I've heard today also is we need new models. A lot of the models that we're working with, whether within our respective fields or within the world that we're inhabiting now, is we need to see the world differently. We need to come together in new ways. So I'm just wondering if the panelists or even anyone in the room has any thoughts on this idea of extra dimensions or that kind of space that is almost indescribable. Jesse, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean...
Wait. Jesse's my physicist.
When you talk about an extra dimension, you really are thinking too small. There's at least 6, and probably more like 20. And I think that if you're thinking it from an artist's point of view, you need to think that way. You need to think there's a lot of extra dimensions. There's a whole bunch of them. The ones that we can see is a very small subset.
But you're thinking about dimensions in space, even. You also know these internal dimensions.
Yeah.
Way more than 20.
What do you mean by internal dimensions?
It's just, yeah, I don't know if that's easy to explain. Yeah, so it's really a conceptual thing. Like anything that you could describe, like a property that you could describe by a number. Like for example, temperature, right? You can think of temperature as a dimension as well. Or yeah, so we often think about like symmetry. So you have like a mathematical concept of symmetries, which kind of tells us how particles relate to each other. So it's just kind of an organization principle. But these symmetries also have internal reflection axes, like, and these are internal dimensions. So we could, so something doesn't just have a position in real space, but also a position in all these other dimensions. For example, a particle will have a particular position in an internal dimension, which will tell you about its properties and how it relates to other particles. So it's just really a way for us to talk about literally anything in a spatial way. So that also allows us to use the tools that we have to talk about like topology, to talk about other concepts as well.
So Wittgenstein talks about the problem we have with language. I mean, what he's not talking about is the incommensurability between one language and another, but rather those things that language can't express. So I think that some of what we're kind of needing to do is to find new language. Because if you think about that, and this is why it's so important that you speak your mother tongue, because there are certain concepts that are in your language that cannot be expressed in other languages because they don't exist in thought. So the language doesn't develop. I'm not sure which comes first, the thought or the language, but that we need, that's where we find ourselves now in this moment where we have to think otherwise and we have no words. So what's happening here I see as a kind of different kind of behavior. So what's happening between the scientists and artists, this grappling with not only answers, but questions, and that the questions beg a different kind of language. This is where I'm getting
I think that's very interesting that you say that actually, because I speak 2 languages, and I feel like a ever so slightly different person in both languages, and I feel like what I say is also guided by the language that I have available to me. So indeed, like extrapolating, like what you are sort of allowed to think by the language in science and art also guides what you will actually think.
Hands everywhere. UN. So,
Hello. I would like to know where you would like to see this kind of project evolve in the future under kind of the ideas of, one, the name of leaning out of windows and just general interactions of people from different groups. I'm thinking on one side with the first exhibition, the subject was extremely precise on antimatter, very much in the physicist world, not the artist world. So the artists were really leaning far out of their windows. The physicists were comfortable on their couches. They weren't leaning very far anywhere. In this other round, the theme was more general. The physicists perhaps were leaning a little bit out of their windows because you could say that emergence is kind of anti-reductionist, so less scientific for some of us feeling. But you can still find ways to make it work. But the artists were more comfortable because they can think of ways emergence fits in their lives more. And then the art produced was quite different in the two phases. I've heard you say that in the first phase it's maybe a bit more one-dimensional, linear, or specific, but more general in this later phase. How would you want that to move forward? So would you want things to become more general, like in this later phase? Would you want things to be forcing people to lean even further out of their windows in a different version?
I'm looking at you and thinking defenestration. It's hard to say right now. It's hard to say right now because we're still in the middle of it, and I think part of this process is very much about processing the information. I know that Ingrid would like to do the whole process again with a whole new design and a new configuration of artists, and to keep it going in some way in response to what's happened here, in response to what happened before that. I think at this point, generally, I'll pass the mic to Ingrid afterward, but we're sort of hoping that maybe we can start a Center for Art and Science here at Emily Carr to continue the work that we've been doing. I don't know what form it would take, but I think that we both feel that there's momentum here, and there's enthusiasm, and there's a desire from physicists, from scholars, from artists to participate in this collaborative and interdisciplinary way of working of this methodology. So I feel like there's something there, but there's a lot more reflection, I would say. I don't know if you want to.
We have another comment here. Oh, there was one thing, sorry.
Yeah, so we're still moving along that model, like as Jessie says, we're just in a cocoon state. And it just feels like each time we're doing this, we're getting a new sense of other questions or other ways that we might configure these interactions. This aspect of language that Mimi brings up, and your examples of words in indigenous languages that speak about context, it seems to be such a huge, important way to consider where problem solving in this world right now, and like what Kim was saying as well about the current crisis that we have, and how do we solve problems, how do we come to a place of imagining what we couldn't have thought of before. And the question, going back to the language, and like physicists talk about how there are no things, there are only relations between things. And so that nothing is unto itself. And yet we still act as if it's all separate. And so education as well, like where do we start thinking that way? Like physics ideas 100 years ago were radical and taking those ideas in, whereas now we're born into, yeah, sure, we know we're made of atoms, and it's just like a given. So where we keep going from that point is always way higher, I think, than, because we have another kind of a plateau that we can move from. So, so I guess in a sense we're trying to move those plateaus, and this aspect of interrelation and context is such a huge part, and how can we
continue to push that and model out areas of interactions between knowledge practices. It still comes back to that, and we need to do way more in trying to do that. And perhaps also worldwide, like, you know, connecting to other groups in the world that are trying to do this as well.
I'd like to go back to your original comments about the importance of coming up with new models and the comments about problem solving. And also thinking back to Kimberly Phillips' comments in the first panel about this process, about collaboration leading to emergence. And I'd just like to share with you an example of how important and how powerful that process can actually be. I'm talking about the concept of human consciousness. Now, psychologists and physicians and psychiatrists and other people have been navel-gazing about this for decades, and there's been nothing new on the horizon that explains human consciousness until very recently. It hasn't gotten into popular consciousness yet, but it will, I think, shortly, because to me it's one of the most exciting things as someone with a background in life sciences. It used to be thought that human consciousness was just a matter of neurons firing synapses, following simple algorithms, like a binary computer. And the thought was that if we build computers big enough with enough binary algorithms, it'll evolve into consciousness. Well, there is a professor emeritus of math and physics at Oxford, Sir Roger Penrose, who's been studying, theoretical physics all his life, but also the idea that quantum physics may play a role in consciousness, which is a very new idea. There were other people that have advanced this thought. He got together with an anesthesiologist in Arizona, Stuart Hemroff, who's been studying things like microtubules, and the two of them have come up with a radical new theory of human consciousness that, although there are lots of skeptics, to me is probably the most exciting thing on the horizon. And these two people from very disparate backgrounds have come up with something that is very novel and I think will lead to further exciting research. And as an aside, to me it was interesting, the title, Leaning Out of Windows, involving artists and scientists. I don't know who picked that topic, but there's a really interesting example of that. The St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, which is a Gothic church, started in 1100, finished in the 1500s, has a very unique signature of one of the main sculptures, designers, architects thereof. His name was Anton Pilgrim, and he was a really excellent sculptor, designer, and architect. And his signature on the cathedral is him with a compass in his hand leaning out of a window.
I feel like maybe our next topic is consciousness. I know that Jess has been talking about that because Jess was saying that when we were talking about emergence, he was saying consciousness is just another way to describe emergence, or emergence is another way to describe consciousness, and then basically it's magic, right? Is your description. So it's kind of interesting to hear that consciousness coming through again. We have time for a few more questions.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say absolute huge thanks to all the panelists and organizers. Such a wonderful project. I'm not a part of this project, I've just been watching it for the last couple of years since becoming aware of it. And it's such a rich source of inspiration for me, so thank you all so much. And for making this event open to the public as well, for people who are not part of the team but can come and learn about what happened and really get to know what the collaboration process is like. And I have a comment about the language piece that you were talking about, Mimi, about that language It just there's no question, just a comment I want to make in terms of something I've been thinking about throughout the Translation Hub today. And the language I was thinking about is like body movement and embodied experience. To contextualize my comment, I am a dancer. I think about dance like a lot. And I think about movement a lot. And I think a lot of things that I heard today really resonated with that movement piece. Something was mentioned in the first panel, I think Kimberly mentioned it. And it was a sentence about a process of coming into form. And when I heard that, to me that really resonated as well. When I think about my own contemporary dance practice, it's just kind of like perfectly describes that tension, constantly coming into form, but constantly in motion. And when I think about emergence and kind of digest everything I heard today and digest the whole, the artworks and everything, I think so much about like dynamics and movement. And I start thinking about how that would be represented in that embodied experience of people moving and creating like living, performing artworks. So I just want to say thank you for the inspiration. I think there's a dancer who was involved this time around, right? So that's wonderful. I really hope that the Art Science Institute or whatever that might look like goes forward, that the project moves forward. And it would be really, really interesting to see if there's some sort of a focus or question about movement as like one of the languages perhaps.
Any other burning questions, comments? Thank you.
So I'm the only one from my team here. Is it working? Yeah. I just wanted to say to Mimi that it's very fascinating what you've shown us, like this resonance between images, so like the scientific image versus the artist image. And it made me think about my process. So like my communication in my team was quite hard just because it wasn't fluid. We were trying, but it was very difficult. But towards the end, after I took on like art theme was DK, and I was relating to DK in terms of my process of printmaking and making charcoal. So I was working in the studio and I decided to send a picture of my work to my physicist. And he wrote back to me, "This is very physicsy," in brackets, and I love that because I was like, that's a compliment. He's like basically telling me that it relates to science in some ways. And then he sent me an image. And the image he sent me is a photograph of the bubble chamber, which physicists would be better than me to explain what it is, where they're like tracking a particle moving. Okay, I'm not going to try to explain it because there's too many physicists around. Anyway, the image became the background where my little work are installed. So it was kind of a way for me to situate the work I was making, to like give it a ground to stand on. So I just like, when you were talking, I was just relating to that process and just thinking in terms of collaboration. Language speaking was not working, but this exchange of visual image just was wonderful for me. So maybe that's like a new way to think about collaboration, which is maybe it's like physicists look at art and then send an image, and then the artists look at the image, and well, I'm responding to image, but it could be so many different kinds of things. But yeah, that's just a comment.
Coming from another space, from another place, and I came to this country at 27, completely different.
You need to hold it a little closer.
So the experience was very different in terms of color, sound. Even though I spoke English, it was a different accent. I went A-E-I-O-U, the Canadians didn't. So just speaking from a personal, as you said, situating yourself. So the music, when you talk about music, I react differently to Sarega than to Do Re Mi, in a completely different emotional space. And so I came to IKEA to find out, where am I lost in translation? What am I not feeling? Why am I not feeling the people around me? What is it that I don't feel? Or why is it that I've lost feeling, or now I don't even react to the people around me? So the process became debriefing for me. debriefing what my belief systems were and the language I learned, and debriefing the visual. I'm a painter mainly, but I do other work. So to come to understand, coming in, so many of us are now moving from all across the world into different spaces, is to finding that that language beyond language actually disrupt language of every kind, whether it's science. So if I'm seeing, like, you did the particle with the 5-point star, to me that signifies a whole different, I react in a different way. So to come to a middle space where one is aware that this is alien to someone else at the same point without losing. So we have a saying at home that says, I used to walk like a crane, but I wanted to learn how to walk like a crow. Now I forgot how to walk like a crane. So it's metaphoric. And so I did a project where I went up to people on the street and I said, where are you from? Can you write a metaphor for me? So because I realized every language, every culture has metaphor, which is abstract in its meaning. And so I got them to write on silk, became banners at the Carr Free Festival, where I thought people would talk to each other and say, what does that say? So it was written in, say, whatever, in Sanskrit or Hindi or English. And so people from different languages would ask each other, so you're listening to sound, you're looking at a visual, and there's a metaphor. So there was a Polish saying that said, I'm a drop in the ocean, part of the same water, but yet I'm a drop in the ocean. I'm my drop in that ocean. And I had never heard that before. So when you were talking about metaphor that way, so that became a project for me to understand through metaphor how you think, or what is it particular to your space that I need to understand so that I can make a connection in real space. When we're all sitting around, when we're all in a class together or in a restaurant together, that connection that you're making. So I think to debrief, to disrupt language actually nearly would be, and now, with the First Nations, with the, with us, all of us were conscious that you all are here, that you all exist, but for someone who comes from outside to connect, to connect, how do you speak to a language that you have no idea where the emotions are, or how do you say hello or that, and so how do you find that middle ground within the whole concept of science or language? So that's...
Thank you. Anyone else?
This has been a really very interesting discussion, and the question of what could be the next dimension, and with Mimi here and just representing the relations of Indigenous people and their relations with other living entities that exist on this earth. And one thing that I've noticed in this discussion here, on the most part, we're just talking within the context of the human experience. But we are one of an estimated 8.5 million different living species on this earth. And somehow we've tricked ourselves into believing that we are the ones that hold intelligence. But all life on earth has this intelligence, and maybe that's the next, that is the next dimension, is that we start to open up to observe the intelligence of other species. And we're starting. We've got relations with dogs and cats and birds and fish, but all around us is life, and we're busy sort of trying to define small particles, when in actual fact maybe we should be looking out at this thing called life and learning from it. And when I hear stories from Indigenous stories about their relations with other animals, I may not be able to connect with them right now, but it does allow me the opportunity to realize that there are these other relations. And perhaps that is the dimension that could be explored. Maybe that's where we could go with that.
Thank you. I'm wondering if that's a really good place for us to conclude at. Do we have any other, I just wanted to bring us here. Just to say thank all of you, the artists, the scientists, the scholars for participating in this production phase, for Margaret and Vera for contributing to the whole, but also for the panel today, all of our panelists here today, research assistants, Ingrid, Koenig,
Cutler, the antimatter artists and scientists, and our friends and colleagues who have also, and our president who have come to join us here today. Yes. So there's a lot that you've given us today as well as we look at what's next. Definitely, Jess keeps asking us what's next, and yeah, we don't want to lose this momentum and such rich ideas about how to generate the next, learning from this and how do we generate this next level of interactions.
So to be continued in the extra dimensions. Thank you so much.